Accessibility Care Beyond the University Disability Office by May Lexi Zarita. April 2025. Master's Project submitted to the College of Education and Community Innovation at Grand Valley State University in partial fulfillment of the degree of Master of Education. Acknowledgements. Thank you to the CSEL faculty for trying to accommodate my needs and acknowledging when they could not. As I began to get to know them, the better they understood the nature of my disability and how to be supportive. Thank you to Dr. Bleisma for humoring my email antics and being a supportive professional who I can lean on for a second perspective. Thank you to my trans sisters who make up the Lambda Delta sorority. You have been with me for my darkest times at GVSU, where bigoted hostility is shockingly common. Thank you to Devin Goldstein for inviting me into disability culture and creating a family in DC that I will soon be joining. May Lexi Zarita. Abstract. When higher education institutions rely on a single office to provide primarily in-class accommodations for students with diagnosed disabilities, practitioners beyond this office receive little guidance on supporting the broader disabled community in daily practices. By critiquing the dominant models, theories, interventions, and solutions that create an ambiguous responsibility for how practitioners are to include and accommodate disabled people, the project can outline alternative methods. A culture of ableism and rampant inaccessibility is innate to how North American education operates as an institutional practice. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is treated like a successful initiative that guarantees reasonable accommodations for disabled people, when in the lived experience of the majority of disabled people, it's far from even useful. The bureaucratic structure that silos disabled people's needs is based on the medical model of disability. It fails to guarantee accommodations, it places all responsibility on the person requiring care, and it often demands more effort than the original tasks. Practitioners can make substantial contributions to meeting the needs of disabled people without the use of accommodations. After critically examining the current state of disability support, practitioners can identify inaccessibility within their local context and collaborate with disabled people to address their needs. Practitioners can address immediate challenges while assisting disabled people in navigating bureaucratic processes. The AMBI solution exercise supports the learning process by offering applied examples for alternative support methods that work in parallel with current standards. These digestible learning materials are sculpted from critical disability theory, mixed queer-crip cultural practices, social justice counseling competencies, and professional experiences in creating disability-centric communities, programs, and systems. If practitioners feel more comfortable actively helping disabled people, we can push our campus cultures towards accessibility that goes beyond the minimal compliance with federal regulations. In the period following the establishment of the Americans with Disability Act, higher education's culture and practitioners put undue faith in the designated disability support offices, disability offices, to effectively and sufficiently meet the needs of disabled people. Higher education as an industry claims to serve disabled people to facilitate their full inclusion in university life, while placing the priorities of a normative, able-bodied culture above the needs of disabled people. Higher education routinely upholds ableist structures and limits itself to the bare minimum required by federal law, all while using neoliberal progressive buzzwords like inclusion, diversity, and accessibility to celebrate supposed success. These words fail to address the underlying oppressive structures and mask this population's unpleasant, unacknowledged outcomes. Practitioners' knowledge of disability accommodations is surface level in understanding the laws, processes, and outcomes. Practitioners are instructed to perpetuate these systems and are given no practical guidance on how to serve the population beyond a referral. Significance and rationale of the project. This work comes during a surge of disabled students enrolling in higher education worldwide. Institutions are increasingly responsible for the behavior of their students as well as their safety. Even after the popularization of the social model of disability, higher education has not shaken off its historically held conceptions of disability. The term disabled people is chosen for this project because it includes faculty, staff, and campus visitors inside the context of whom practitioners must be conscious of each day. This terminology expands previously held conceptions of who requires help from our practitioners to be more than just students. Practitioners, those who work for the university, may be informed of the existence, challenges, and needs of disabled students. However, professional guidance on how to support disabled people when practitioners do not work in the disability office is often elusive in daily practice, minimalizing or ineffective. Research and general practice guidance is overly centered on solving the academic challenges of diagnosed disabled students, when this focus leaves many disabled people in higher education invisible in accessibility work. Leaving this issue unattended risks perpetuating historically poor treatment of disabled people in higher education to preserve the status quo. This project addresses the practice gap by reorienting established beliefs about disability and access. The new methods of practice are a combination of critical theory, disabled cultural practices, and higher educational counseling strategies. A commitment to these methods begin with increased recognition of accessibility issues within the system and the lives of disabled people, evolving into a gradual practice of assisting in tackling these challenges. The importance and rationale will start with a bit about my experiences with a disability that has informed this project, then move on to contextualizing all relevant players, systems, and concepts in a large summary form. This is not to serve as an overview of the entire problem, nor is it specific. The target audience is North American higher educational practitioners without explicit duties in disability accommodations and supporting disabled populations. Then there is an overview of how the current process frequently fails for people with disabilities. Finally, we will break down the risks inherent in the fallacy of trusting these processes' ability to effectively serve disabled people implicitly. At the close of this problem section, there is an overview of what outcomes the current system creates. On personal and communal disabled experience. I possess a long series of disabilities, medical conditions, and identities that all mix into a complex whole person. These intersections and uncontrollable factors create situations, challenges, and problems that are my responsibility to contend, cope with, or resolve. I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, in second grade after an exhaustive battery of tests. My parents, doctors, and school tried many ways to get me to pay attention and succeed in class, and I appreciate their efforts. This brought me into direct contact with the systems that manage disability in education systems. Growing up in a culture that prioritized athleticism and facing a physically abusive parent resulted in frequent punching, kicking, and being struck in the head throughout my life. The severity of this problem would only become apparent during my 2022 concussion when I walked into a glass wall while trying to take a test in my undergrad. My doctor's support system and I couldn't fully understand why a seemingly minor impact called double vision, slurred speech, and an inability to walk and spell without help. When I explored my history with concussions, I uncovered a long history with my head injuries that went unaddressed, leaving me extremely sensitive to head injury. The concussion forced me to come to terms with unacknowledged aspects of my disability. It allowed me to identify more challenges I had, such as my extreme height exacerbating many of my issues. Audio sensitivity, light sensitivity, body coordination, spatial awareness, executive function, autism, and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, POTS, which causes frequent weakness and lightheadedness. Throw in a major psychotic crisis, a car crash, and a major knee injury, and I can confidently say that I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. What has been most helpful through this long 24-year journey is claiming disability and connecting with those who shared my experiences. By declaring my ADHD as a superpower in middle school, I began a long series of radical reclamations of my identity that has continued to positively impact my life and the lives of others. I erased the deficit view of disability that was constantly reinforced in school. A pivotal experience was My Access, a nonprofit team of disabled youth across Michigan who worked to progress public health, education, and social justice work to more accessible horizons for everyone through coalition building, community engagement, and educational opportunities. Through connecting with others, I have gained a deeper, healthier, and more productive understanding of how the inaccessible world can be navigated. I want this project to distill my disability-centric cultural practices into a practical disability access creation guide that works through individual relationships, increased recognition of systemic causes of inaccessibility, and system reform. By creating this, I can share materials with fellow practitioners interested in better serving disabled people. Practitioner role in disabled care. The term practitioner will be used in this paper to describe any institutional, professional staff, student worker, graduate assistant, faculty administrator, community leader, decision maker, stakeholder, and virtually anybody who does not work in the disability office who might come into contact with a disabled person at our universities. This project is oriented around practitioners and their role in disabled support. Practitioners each play a specific role in the bureaucratic machine of their institution. They have varying levels of experience, education, and training. Many want to help students with disabilities to be successful, or send them to someone else who will help them. Practitioners may not be aware of several aspects of the disabled person's status, bureaucratic journey, or how their disability limits their ability to navigate the world. Practitioners might receive instructions to refer students experiencing challenges with disabilities to a person or office that can arrange accommodations to address issues of access, particularly for obtaining accommodations in the student's class. Practitioners outside the disability office can legally assist disabled people facing disability-related challenges, but the specifics of what they could do remains unclear and will be discovered through the research. Most of the help provided to disabled people with disability-related challenges stops after the referral to the person or office responsible. The taken for granted meaning of access refers to the widely held assumption that because the ADA mandates accommodations and certain offices are responsible for implementing them, universities consistently provide adequate support for disabled people. In reality, these measures often fail to meaningfully transform the accessibility of spaces of disabled individuals. However, practitioners may not recognize this, resulting in disabled people receiving inadequate support. Dismantling this assumption is a core process of this project. Experiences of disabled people and students. In higher education practice, disability is usually defined using the ADA, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Higher education places more funding, care, and attention on serving professionally diagnosed disabled students. It often neglects to mention research or create practices for helping disabled staff, faculty, and campus visitors. Disabled people, including disabled students, have worse economic, health, and academic outcomes than non-disabled peers. The culture of ableism in higher education and the complex of bureaucratic processes that disabled individuals must navigate to obtain accommodations or support make earning a degree a daunting task. Disabled people within higher education may be encouraged to use the ADA accommodation system. This process can be complex, overwhelming, unaffirming, dehumanizing, time-intensive, underwhelming, and ineffective. This process relies on the medical model of disability, leading institutions to distrust disabled people's ability to describe their access needs and politely ignore them in favor of medical professionals who lack their lived experience. Here is a telling quote from Smith and Mueller's 2022 article, which exemplifies the issue. Active attempts by people with severe disabilities to exercise control over their lives often has been described as problem behavior. Page 48, end quote. Because of how demanding and exhausting the process is, most disabled students who attend higher education do not receive sufficient support. Some research suggests that continuous use of accommodations for some students with disabilities may lead to improved academic outcomes. The following statistics describe the general outcomes for disabled people and disabled students in the U.S. Only 16.4% of disabled people have earned a bachelor's degree, compared to over double that percentage among those without disabilities. Students with disabilities face higher dropout rates, longer time to degree completion, and worse academic outcomes compared to their non-disabled peers. According to the Center for Disease Control 2022 data gathered from the United States, D.C., and its territories on people age 18 and above, an estimated 28.7% of that population identifies as disabled. Number 73 million. According to the fall 2023 National Survey of 18,755 undergraduate students, 35.2% identified as having a disability. Approximately 60% of college students with disabilities either do not report their disabilities or opt not to register them. The graduation rates for students with disabilities at four-year institutions stand at 34.8%, while for students without disabilities, the rate is 51.2%. A 2023 article cites a 2020 report about a 2017 longitudinal study about students enrolling in university in 2011. At four-year colleges with students with disabilities have a six-year graduation rate of 49.5%, lower than the roughly 68% rate for peers without disabilities. Background of the project: legal landscape. Key laws and court rulings shape the legal landscape for disabled accommodations in higher education. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark law that established individuals to seek redress for discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. However, it did not initially include disability as a protected category. Disability was later incorporated into civil rights law through the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically Section 504. This act formally defined disability, as discussed in definition section, and enforced compliance with withholding federal funding from organizations that failed to meet anti-discrimination requirements. It also stipulated that colleges and universities are not obligated to identify students with disabilities. Instead, students must self-disclose their needs. Institutions are further required to inform prospective and current students about available accommodations and facilities built or renovated after 1977 with federal funds must be accessible. A pivotal Supreme Court decision, Southeastern Community College v. Davis, clarified that reasonable accommodations must not impose excessive financial or administrative burdens on an institution or fundamentally alter its programs. The case established the legal precedent that individuals must be capable of performing the essential functions of a position or meeting a program's core requirements, even with accommodations. During the years after the Rehabilitation Act and before the ADA, universities were highly reluctant to accommodate anybody in their institution because of perceived cost, complexity, and disruption of the regular operations, and they would go through great legal lengths to avoid this responsibility. The ADA extended anti-discrimination protections to most public and private entities, including higher education institutions, and it reinforced the existing framework established by prior laws and court decisions. By requiring the designation of an ADA coordinator, the ADA formalized accommodation processes and created dedicated offices at the college and universities. Meanwhile, in K-12, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, of 1975 governs K-12 accommodation systems, which are generally more customized, prescriptive, and comprehensive. Accommodations at the K-12 level are often automatically provided based on a student's documented access needs, contrasting the self-disclosure model in higher education. Consequently, 81% of students who used accommodations in high school do not continue using them in college, creating confusion and challenges for disabled students transitioning to post-secondary education. the higher education accommodation process. The accommodation process developed from the ADA legislation may be how faculty, staff, and students access accommodations at an institution. There is a variation in whom the ADA serves at an institution. The specifics of the process can vary according to the institution's type and specific policy decisions it has adopted. The Association of Higher Education and Disability, AHED, created in 1977, is the leading U.S.-based professional association for individuals developing policies, procedures, and services to ensure equitable access for students with disabilities in higher education. The document, titled Supporting Accommodation Requests, Guidance on Documentation Practices, is the foremost guideline for shaping accommodation processes. The process can generally look like this. 1. A doctor diagnoses a disabled individual and provides documentation specifying the accommodation the school should provide. 2. The disability office reviews this request and assesses whether the recommended accommodation can be granted based on the context of the class or industry requirements. 3. The office selects the accommodation from a predetermined list and directs the disabled individual to provide a letter outlining the request accommodations to their professor or employer. 4. The professor or employers then decide whether to follow the recommendations in the document, as they have the authority to approve or reject the accommodations. Accommodations are typically only advertised or offered to students, rather than staff or faculty, predetermined by a set list, focused on physical access, provided only for a single course during a single semester, structured to avoid interfering with professors' preferences, and narrowly focused on meeting the minimum legal standards of the ADA and Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. Reaching the point where accommodations can be used requires overcoming numerous hurdles within various bureaucratic systems. Here are some statistics that illustrate this point. 48% of disabled students receive no guidance on accessing the accommodations. 71% of students fail to return to the accommodation office for follow-up after initial registration. 30% of students seeking accommodations discontinue their use after just one meeting. 38% of professors support implementing accommodations for students with disabilities. 25.8% of students use accommodations beyond a single semester. While specific supports and measures gained from the accommodation system can be beneficial, the intricate procedure for securing and applying them frequently leaves many students with disabilities feeling unsupported and isolated because their social, academic, and accessibility needs remain unmet. The new methods of practice in accessibility care. Given that this project aims to improve support for disabled individuals in our environments, it is essential to consider the alternative strategies and supplement resource beyond the traditional accommodation system. The proposed approach for this initiative is based on cultural practices from queer and crip theory, along with action-oriented methods used in higher education counseling. Within disabled communities, there exists a strong collective understanding that accessibility is a shared responsibility. By integrating these cultural insights, practitioners can more effectively address the diverse needs of this population. The new practice methods focus on identifying what practitioners can do to help the disabled people rather than remedying the disabled people's perceived deficiencies. This approach requires addressing the practitioner's fallacies and framing of access before providing disabled development-centric solutions. Eventually, we will address what things disabled people generally need to be successful, but that comes after addressing practitioners' development needs. Our primary task will be addressing the thought patterns of practitioners in how they contextualize the experiences of disabled people, what questions they should ask, and what appropriate things to check for when following up. Universal design. Universal design was pioneered by architect Ronald L. Mace in the late 1970s. It is a design methodology aimed at creating environments, products, and services that everyone can access, regardless of age or ability. In higher education, universal design learning is an industry-specific iteration of universal design, usually used to retool curriculums to be more accessible. Universal design learning has 9 core principles: equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use, community of learners, and instructional climate. These principles are applied to create spaces and systems that integrate increased flexibility, clarity, safety, and inclusion across various design contexts. The universal design iterations are now broadly adopted in building construction, technology interfaces, and educational programs to eliminate barriers and promote inclusion through accessibility. Employing these principles from the start of a project can lessen the need for retrofitting while ensuring widespread usability. One could argue that faculty and staff practitioners' excitement over universal design stems from an intellectual response to the widespread inaccessibility of systems and spaces. Intellectual in the sense that those within academic or professional spheres who recognize systemic inaccessibility prioritize it as the preferred solution to endorse because of its comparative value to the status quo. Universal design proposes changes that may solve many of our current issues. However, the actions relevant to executing those changes are far outside the daily operations of the average practitioner. Universal design is ipso facto a design process. Hamare critiques that only a small sect of our institution is responsible for designing anything that could substantially implement the proposed transformative changes. Thus, this solution is without practical mechanisms for practitioners' use in a daily basis. Additionally, the hype surrounding universal design reflects a deep bias towards adopting solutions that center on non-disabled people. Students living with disability studies. Students living with disability studies, SWD studies, is a broad field of research that centers on the experience and treatments used in helping disabled students. These studies assess various outcomes, including students' resilience, self-advocacy skills, and feelings of belonging, and document how the institution assisted them in navigating these challenges. In SWD studies, disabled students should self-actualize much of their access. Practitioners, usually disability office staff, are expected to help in this development process. This field focuses on what students need to do to improve and what practitioners and their offices can do to improve student outcomes. Nothing is fundamentally wrong with wanting students to go through the accommodation process or their classes with sufficient confidence, communication skills, and self-driven motivation. Where critical disability theory conflicts with SWD studies is in believing that students are ultimately responsible for their outcomes. Using the stepped care model to empower university students with learning disabilities by Jackson Abel 2020 is an exploratory single case example paper. It is a perfect example of what this project will not be. The medical model of disability is the dominant theoretical basis, and the author uses it to contextualize students with learning disabilities with a deficit mindset. It focuses solely on the failings of the disabled student, rather than examining how the environment may be failing them. The authors encouraging using the stepped care model, which they describe as being created to increase efficiency, lower cost, and eliminate inconveniences when treating mental and addict patients. They hope to increase the population's resiliency and self-reliance. See the definition of terms section for the differences in this project's approach to contextualizing the disabled experience. Addressing the deeply rooted cultural and systemic issues apparent in how higher education treats disabled people requires us to reframe historical narratives like the ones found in Jackson Abel's 2020. SWD studies researchers advocate for solutions that increase student resiliency, self-advocacy skills, employability skills, or identity development to modulate their affinity towards or away from the label disabled. To reiterate, these are fine solutions, but are overly centered on how students are deficient and not on the practitioner's role in creating inaccessible spaces and systems. Smith and Mueller's 2022 put it best by saying, teachers should advocate for policies that locate the problem of disability in the inaccessible environments and put work towards solutions that address those environments rather than the individuals themselves. Page 52, end quote. Statement of purpose. The purpose of this project is to comprehensively address the deeply ingrained fallacies that higher education practitioners generally hold about the disabled experience and offer radically critical and applicable practices that meaningfully empower disabled people who inhabit or navigate higher education spaces. This first part of the purpose requires exploring, examining, and explaining the lived experiences of disabled people in higher education and the root cause of the access breakdowns. The second part of the purpose will contextualize how the lived behaviors of practitioners can effectively serve a multitude of disabled experiences through acts of action empathy using crip and queer theory in cultural practice. There is a wealth of well-practiced knowledge outside of contemporary academic circles that do not need to worry about the bureaucratic higher education quagmire of practice. This project is designed for those truly committed to accessibility in their work or community service. Objectives of the project. The project's primary objective is dismantling dominant notions of how higher education creates access and supports disabled people. This entails deconstructing how higher education defines access and reattaching its meaning to the lived experience of disabled people, so root causes can be better identified and addressed. Highlight the limitations of the accommodations model's current form by examining its minimal, legalistic, dehumanizing, and bureaucratic nature while recognizing the value of ADA rights and the accommodations currently offered. The literature review will chisel away through a critique of the dominant notions and explore proposed solutions. The secondary objective is to provide a developmental path for practitioners to recognize better gaps in support, disability challenges, and inaccessibility of higher education spaces, programs, and systems. The critique clears previously held assumptions and then plants a lens that trains the practitioner to identify where the breaks in access come from, achieving this secondary objective. The tertiary objective creates new practice methods that include specific examples, scenarios, and guides that outline where practitioners can insert themselves into supporting disabled people through their everyday actions. This objective serves as the action step to Objective 2, where practitioners identify these challenges. The content throughout the paper will feature examples of inaccessibility, and the project description will respond to them through proposed approaches. Definition of terms. In accessibility care beyond the University Disability Office, all labels and contextual conceptions are up for review. Thus, it is challenging to provide clear terms or definitions. Attempting to define anything is inherently exclusionary since it decrees what is and is not. For practitioners' purposes, the ADA definitions do textually suit most experiences. However, as we will see, legal definitions, enforcement, and practice do not always align. While it is tempting to find and propose a single, narrow definition of the various experiential concepts present for this paper, doing so will inevitably limit or exclude other conceptions. The nature of this project is to scrutinize how we conceptualize the disabled experience. Therefore, model conceptions have been provided that will be up for review. Readers may note the lack of person-first language in this project and or the omission of CRIP. Disability justice is often defined by bold linguistic reclamations, such as the term CRIP, which appears in many critical disability works and initiatives. There has been a shift in academic language to not define entire groups with adjectives or single words. The historic use of these words is most often associated with the continued suppression of less than. In its place, person-first language has been proposed and widely adopted. People living with disabilities, or its variation, have no immediate obvious negative connotations and is quite descriptive of the experience. Critics have argued that person-first language, in the case of disability, perpetuates the conception of disability as a negative or unwanted identity. This further entrenches the notion that disabled people are not full persons. Let's break down the terms conceptually. In the first person form, disability coincides with a person's existence. In the term disabled person, disabled is an adjective that describes the act or reality of disablement. The decision to use disabled people for this paper is to more accurately reflect that disability only comes from the result of external interactions. One cannot be disabled alone. End quote. LaJoy, 2021, page 324. We are disabled because the world and the people we are forced to interact with make it inaccessible. Do not take this as a recommendation that practitioners abandon the commonly used first-person term. Readers may also note that the term disabled people is not capitalized. This is an intentional choice. Disabled people usually describe a collective people with shared values, views, and culture. Many of the disabled people practitioners will come across will not have a strong identity salience toward disabled identity collectives because much of who we are is siloed and shamed by medical, governmental, and educational systems. The separation is another area that distinguishes disability from the other protected identities in the U.S. The primary crowd of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 more readily benefited from the robust collective initiatives towards national equity for the group. Ultimately, it's up to the individual to decide how they want to be identified. In an ideal world, individuals have the agency to decide what they are called. However, more often than not, disabled people are told who they are and what their needs are. This issue is particularly evident in the medical model of disability, where a person's disability is narrowly defined by symptomatic traits and diagnosed by someone deemed more qualified. Self-diagnosis has a long history and has recently gained recognition as a method for individuals to identify their own identities and needs more effectively. However, higher education's accommodation system do not permit such flexibility in qualification. These systems were established based on the medical model at their legal inception and routinely assign terms to individuals without consulting them on how they contextualize their own identities. The following is a list of terms and conceptions that will be used throughout the project. Disabled people are contextualized as singular entities with unforeseeable needs and desires. This encourages practitioners to not leap to assumptive measures about their needs and engage in dialogue to discover how to accommodate them. Any negative experiences or outcomes will be automatically presumed to result from external factors outside of the disabled person's control. Solutions offered will not prioritize efficiency, cost, or perceived inconvenience. Instead, they will prioritize minimal addition of effort on the part of the disabled person, strengthen collaborative relationship between relevant parties, and address root causes whenever possible. Mind and body are not necessarily considered separate. In a literal sense, the mind exists in the body, and the body is controlled by the mind, or the brain. Critical disability justice models. This perspective views disability as a natural and essential aspect of human life, challenging traditional rhetoric that disability itself is an impairment. It believes that all people have inherent value. It critiques the societal structures and power dynamics that define disability and advocates for a justice-oriented approach that addresses intersecting forms of oppression. The social model of disability. According to this model, disability arises from the societal barriers that hinder individuals with impairments from full participation. It posits that society's failure to accommodate the diverse needs of disabled people rather than their impairments. Medical model. In this traditional view, disability is a health condition or impairment intrinsic to the individual, requiring medical intervention to fix or cure the deficit. It emphasizes diagnosis and treatment, often neglecting the role of societal barriers in the disabling process. ADA definitions. Actual disability. A physical or mental impairment substantially limiting one or more major life activities. Rehabilitation Act, 1973. Definition of handicap individual. Any individual who has a physical or mental disability, which for such individual constitutes or results in a substantial handicap to employment and can be reasonably expected to benefit in terms of employability from vocational rehabilitation services provided pursuant to Titles 1 and 3 of this Act. Higher education takes on the additional context of being a post-ADA US-based university and college industry practice rather than a general worldwide institution devoid of temporality. Related to this is the term university, being used to describe institutions of higher education, including colleges and four-year and graduate degree granting institutions. AHEAD's definition of accommodation. The modifications of policies, practices, and procedures, the provision of auxiliary aids and services, academic adjustments and modifications to the environment intended to remove barriers to equivalent access. Disability Office. The offices in higher education institutions that ensure compliance with the ADA by providing accommodations to disabled people are called disability offices for this project. Scope of project. Accessibility care beyond the University Disability Office will be a large academic paper and presentation that comprehensively addresses the inherent cultural challenges of serving disabled people effectively through higher education status quo of minimal services. It will touch on the dominant theories, models, solutions, and practices that have impacted how we conceptualize the disabled experience. The critique provided will be for practitioners who do not work in the disability office and wish to, over time, expand their perspective to be more critical of the root causes of ableism in higher education. The new methods will be expounded upon in the final portion of the project and outline how a practitioner can play an active role in the success of disabled people. Students with disability studies, research, and its framing of the disabled experience will not be centered throughout this project, since it is doggedly stuck in conceiving ways to help that exist inside the disability office status quo. Researchers frequently emphasize the necessity for a more significant cultural shift to transform the support of people with disabilities substantially. These statements have an "oh well" sort of tone, since they do not point to a specific force that can propel that change. This project aligns with that transformative cultural solution by encouraging practitioners to consider community access creation in line with disability culture. Something worth mentioning is the challenge of disability disclosures. Disclosure poses a challenge when considering how a practitioner does not have the authority to disclose or know a person's disability status without a written release of information. Laws that currently govern this activity include the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which restrict how practitioners can coordinate student private information. A practitioner's legal ability to know about someone's disability and support access for an individual is highly complex because we may need to acknowledge that we are allowed to see, infer plainly, or if we have been given verbal disclosure. Organizations are sets of relationships and communication between those relationships. Disability culture, community spaces have been able to affirmingly accommodate everyone's accessibility needs without written contracts of medical disclosure. It is possible, but it's best explored in the later parts of the project, which examines the practice solutions. Providing a general response for now should suffice. Practitioners do not need to know the name of any disability diagnosed to provide access-related support. Inquiry into a disabled person's needs should be done out of a desire to offer specific supports rather than idle curiosity. Creating a comfortable environment for individuals with disabilities to share their experiences can make a significant difference. By fostering supportive dialogue, we empower them to decide how and when to disclose details about their disabilities. A few critical disability advocates have pointed out how ironic it is that papers about inaccessible worlds holding back our community's success are written in a language that outsiders cannot read in the academic field. Of course, they are correct that academic language can be needlessly complex. This project will try to be as accessible in its language as possible, especially for the new practice methods. Addressing historic institutional laws and practices like the ADA and AHEAD lies outside this project's scope. Yet, frustration with the legislative, legal, and practical dimensions of the contemporary higher education accommodation system is widespread. Many scholars condemn the culture of minimal compliance, repeating that the ADA sets a floor, not a ceiling. But holistic reform of the entire system of accommodations is beyond the reach of this project. My focus is on what can be improved beyond the system, the new methods of practice that begin with the practitioner's small daily choices, nurture a richer understanding of disabled experience, expose the limits of existing structures, and prompt concrete action. My professor and the principal text from my Student Affairs Administration and Law course reached the same conclusion, arguing that inadequate implementation of the ADA requires ethical considerations to take precedence when law and practice offer few remedies. Ultimately, it is the people who support stagnancy, or it is the people who make a difference. People drive the history, culture, and work of colleges and universities. Boettcher and Salinas, 2023, page 124, end quote. Chapter 2, Literature Review. Introduction. The review of literature compares how conventional and critical theories contextualize points of contention on how to support disabled people in higher education. The models, papers, and conceptions being critiqued are used to frame the inherent risks and challenges of the status quo and how the ADA, practitioners, and academics contextualize disability and treat disabled people. The critical theories, ideas, and solutions unfold how these issues are historically addressed through an individual practitioner's lens. Time will not be wasted exploring the depths of how specific disabilities are excluded. Critique is not a pretext. Accessibility care beyond the University Disability Office as a learning experience requires participants to identify historically and contemporary harmful practices and commit to serving disabled people more fully in our regular work. Imagine a marble block with the inscribed epitaph, New Methods of Disability Practice for Higher Education Practitioners by May Lexi Zarita. This block represents all models, definitions, theories, and principles that will be reviewed and eventually promoted during the project. To have our fully formed sculpture that matches the epitaph's description requires that we chip off significant chunks. Each chunk will be assessed, critiqued, and or acknowledged. We will be left with the primary solutions in the direct context of daily practice. The hammer and chisel are crafted from the authorship of Tanya Tutovsky's and Mixed Feminist Queer Crypt Theory in Culture. The block of marble analogy represents how this literature review is structured and provides an overview of how the theory for this project developed. An example of this analogy in play is the removal of the most significant chunk, the Association on Higher Education and Disabilities Ahead accommodation model. Removal includes delicate handling of the value of ADA-based accommodations and the offices and in institutions that ensure compliance with the ADA through providing accommodations to disabled people. The ADA sets the floor, not the ceiling. The accommodation system at institutions primarily focus on minimal compliance with the ADA by providing reasonable accommodations to primarily students. We will explore how the current process is too bureaucratically complex, invalidating, and ineffective for it to be the only way an institution provides access to disabled people. Similar segments will continue to be removed based on the idea of forming communities composed of active, caring participants who do not work in the disability office and aim to make the world they inhabit more accessible for everyone, particularly for members of the disabled community, by going beyond minimal compliance in everyday work. The following review of related literature and theories guides how a practitioner can become a trusted support, bureaucratic plumber, and a skilled local micro-interventionist. What will remain will primarily be addressed in the next chapter. Only then can we break out finer tools to smooth out the detail of our final sculpture. There is a practice presumption that disability office are solely responsible, resourced, and capable of meeting the needs of disabled people. According to Tutovsky, Careless Care, page 102, leads practitioners outside the disability office to deprioritize supporting disabled individuals they interact with every day. A common way for this responsibility to be deflected is through the use of referrals to the disability office, under the assumption that they will ultimately be more helpful than if they had found a way to accommodate the person. These deeply ingrained biases inherent in neoliberal conceptions of disability and what qualifies as access prevent a critical assessment of the pervasive structural and cultural oppression in university life. It is challenging to reframe a practitioner's intrinsic conception of a complex hyper-object, like the higher education disability diaspora. Thus, new practices must be introduced to help individuals learn to recognize, understand, gradually and actively support disabled people. To help understand the full context of the proposed solutions, we will examine the historical development of disability rights, bureaucracies, and support methods. By reviewing the motivations and application of contemporary disability support practices, we will expose the limitations of these models. The topics reviewed in this paper are the difference between critical disability studies and SWD studies, the risk of defining disability, the history of relevant civil rights laws, a critique of a HEDS accommodation process as the sole method of creating access, a critique of universal design as a solution for general access, how practitioners currently conceive of disability, reflecting on the medical model's pervasiveness in the conception of how to address disability, a look at what it is like to be a disabled student in higher education under the status quo, a look at CRIP time, and an introduction to the value of radical disabled community and how cultural practices in those spaces could be adopted in higher education practice. Theory and rationale. The disabled experience diaspora and the forces that play in it have deeply set history in diverse cultural practices and many differing views. The stage of the review of theories is set by specifying the industry's location, history, and the manifestations of current practices. Then a comprehensive description of the critical conception of disability and disability support will be provided, focusing on how this perspective inverts normative thinking, Relevant theories will be cited, but may not be fully defined. The summary of critical theoretical lens provided is applied throughout the literature's exploration. The North American continent is colonized by primarily Western European kingdoms, colonizers, and colonists, who spread disease, death, and faith through trade, racial violence, enslavement, and subjugation of native peoples. Decolonization is the process of ending colonialist oppressive regimes, healing the psychological, ecological, and cultural scars, acknowledging histories, and removing colonialist influences from a given system. Many colonists and colonizers brought the Christian religion and culture, embedding especially the Protestant work ethic in many American institutions, systems, structures, and cultural expectations. The Protestant work ethic mixed well with the frontier, homestead, independent, and immigrant attitudes. The U.S. is home to multiple succeeding generations of immigrants who wanted to achieve the American dream. The following are some examples of these cultural ideas that have continued to be reinforced through America's development. American culture centers in individual merit and self-reliance, the value of hard work and efficiency, punctuality, timeliness, a stoic acceptance of hardship without complaint, and an entrepreneurial spirit that values innovation and frugality over inherited status. Recognizing these cultural facts of North American culture will be important when assessing and addressing access issues that seem natural to system participants. Capitalism is inextricably linked with Western and especially American ways of life. Critical Marxist perspectives on capitalism describe it as a massive organizing force in society that commodifies labor for the financial and political gain of the bourgeois. In American culture, people are valued based on what they produce. In other words, their value is not inherent. After World War I and II, America became a global industrial superpower, and many of the foundations for current higher education and accessibility contexts resulted from this shift. The rise of neoliberalism is marked by an acceleration of American economic growth through free market ideals. The 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who served from 1981 to 1989, popularized neoliberal privatization, deregulation, and competitive market rhetoric and practices in mainstream America. Reagan was known for attacking what he referred to as the welfare state. During his administration, social services were cut primarily for low-income people of color, and particularly for individuals with disabilities. These cultural practices extended into higher education institutions. The persistent anti-welfare thinking permeates higher education accessibility work by creating the default assumption that those using accommodations are trying to take advantage of these systems. North American higher education evolved with the country through key legislation and court rulings. As Manning, 2013, described, higher education is bureaucratic as a written records of complex, rational division of labor based on rule-governed authority, channels using standardized communications. Bureaucratic systems frequently clash with the needs of individuals with disabilities and are fundamentally interconnected. Higher education has unique qualities like the rigor of academic excellence, collegiate culture among faculty and staff, and its role in developing its young adult students. In loco parentis, a Latin phrase that means in the place of a parent, was core to how universities and courts considered their role in students' lives. As the size of institutions increased, so did their bureaucratic and legal complexity, and in loco parentis was retired as an institutional norm. However, the practice's echoes still appear in many places. Levi Dow, 2002, established a foundation for critically examining how the structure of higher education benefits dominant groups through capitalistic and neoliberal norms. Under this model, the entire higher education system becomes a form of societal stratification that determines who possesses knowledge and who can attain high-paying and influential jobs, and who should receive favorable treatment from our systems. The civil rights era of the 1960s introduced enforcement methods that facilitated increased integration of historically oppressed groups in the U.S. Steiker describes the period following the enactment of significant legislation such as the GI Bill, the Rehabilitation Act, and the ADA as the age of rehabilitation for higher education transformation. This led to the gradual establishment of systems designed to support disabled students and grant civil rights to sue institutions that fail to comply with these regulations. Spawned from this era, AHEAD is an organization of professionals who work in disability services to coordinate student accommodations and ensure university compliance. AHEAD's guidelines establish industry standards and are utilized in legal proceedings to define how universities and their disability offices provide accommodations. It is important to note that the K-12 accommodation system runs from a completely different accommodation system than higher education. The structures created by the ADA and IDEA drive the differences between the systems and lead to higher education yielding much worse outcomes for disabled people. The medical model of disability treats disability as an individual ailment that can eventually be fixed to make the person no longer disabled. For many disabled people, this is their first introduction to the concept of their disability. This often leaves the disabled person feeling some sense of guilt or wrongness about themselves. This stigma may encourage them to hide or diminish this part of themselves so they are not seen as less than. It is important to mention that the higher education accommodation system is based entirely on this system, since it requires that a medical professional diagnose students to be even considered for accommodations. Many contemporary researchers in the education field have switched to using the social model of disability. The social model was created by Mike Oliver, 1990, and posits that disabilities do not originate from the individual, but result from the external world, which is inaccessible and thus disabling. Under this concept, one cannot be disabled alone and requires the identification of specific external factors that limit full participation. Critical models of disability take a similar approach to the social model by focusing on the external world. They expand the lens to include not just specific barriers that limit a person's participation, such as a set of stairs, but also investigate why designers built the stairs in the first place, who contributed to the construction of the space, and why disabled voices were not included in those discussions. Through critical models, it's easier to find the root and systemic causes and put into words the solutions necessary to begin radical change. Ableism dictates that life without disability is preferable to life with disability. Ableism encompasses the systemic negative impacts of colonialism and capitalism on disabled people and the creation and reinforcement of systems and spaces that prioritize able-bodied ways of being. Critical models seek solutions that run counter or outside the dominant ways of thought that have been ineffective at serving our population. The empowering models of thought include intersectional mixed models that integrate feminist, queer, and crip theories. These models seek to foster a community that is strong and exists independently of patriarchal, ableist, and homophobic influences. Most helpful to this project are the many cultural communities built from these theories that have popped up around radical community accessibility. By setting the cultural norm that we all have a responsibility to make spaces accessible to disabled people, we prevent the externalization of disability. The new practice methods will build on community norms that set clear expectations for accommodating disabled individuals. This radical reframing includes practices that can inform the development of these new methods. Practitioners will leverage their existing responsibilities to enhance accessibility in their work and improve the lives of others by utilizing supportive community counseling practices and focusing on specific areas of concern. Tchaikovsky's 2011, 2020, and 2022 writings are comprehensive critiques of North American higher education disability inclusion practices, including Interpretive Relations in Disability Studies in Education, DSE, where personal experiences with disability can be paired with more considerable textual research to speak to more profound insights on why these experiences occur. Using DSE, Cichowski 2011, 2020, and 2022 explores how the University of Toronto, where she is a professor of disability studies in the Department of Social Justice Education, contextualizes her dyslexia and disability. The insights gathered from her authorship often touch on important issues that aren't always touched on in other areas of disability research. Her form of critical disability justice studies seeks to break down commonly held conceptions of how disabled people are helped through institutional systems by scrutinizing how language prevents us from approaching root issues. Through her methods of inquiry, we can identify the daily breakdowns and opportunities where disabled people can be helped. Some argue that bureaucracies remove arbitrary rules. But critical theorists like Cichowski counter this by stating that the rules enforce arbitrary systems and offer little recourse for individuals who do not conform to the expected norm. This paradox poses a significant risk when practitioners suggest reforms to the bureaucratic system, as any such attempts can actually reinforce the paradox. For instance, there is no specific justification for why time and a half on a test is considered the optimal duration for all assessments. A reformist might propose a method to determine the appropriate amount of time a student should receive based on various factors. However, this could lead to increased bureaucracy, creating more complications. Staying conscious of this pitfall can help practitioners help frame how they would like to attempt change making and local micro-interventions in their work. To understand why the proposed approach has inherent value over current status quo practice, we must address a few common phrases seen in research and how critical theories frame them. Universities prioritize minimal compliance. The ADA sets the floor, not the ceiling. Progressive neoliberal diversity, equity, inclusion, and access language is taken for granted. These phrases are often thrown around at the start of many writings that address accommodation system. Cichowski states that the rise in progressive terminology did not necessarily coincide with the perfect application of the language's original principles, especially accessibility. Instead, its popularity masked unpleasant realities about the continued mistreatment, dehumanization, and casual exclusion of disabled bodies from university life. When higher education uses words like accessibility, it's often without mentioning racism, ableism, or inequity. These pretty words sound more positive and make practitioners feel more comfortable when they believe they are a force that created increased access and does not perpetuate ableism. It is challenging for those outside of the disabled experience to conceive of how utilizing the word access and applying minimal compliance with federal laws does not adequately address the needs of disabled people. This is what Cichowski, Leoy, and Borsati et al. Call the taken for granted meaning of access by general practitioners in higher education. Just verbalizing that the campus community is accessible does not make it so, and often makes the fundamental failures of the system invisible. Research included for this project that criticizes higher education for its commitment to minimal compliance spans a variety of sources from textbook like Boettcher and Salinas, Law and Ethics in Academic and Student Affairs, which argue universities to move beyond what the authors defined as compliance. They describe compliance as organizational adherence to laws, guidelines, regulations, and specifications, and the lowest standard of following a policy. Page 43, end quote. Another textbook is Abe's et al. 2023, Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks. Cichowski has criticized minimal compliance along works by Linton. that is also referenced by a head to claim their processes align with both the letter and spirit of the law. This range of perspective exemplifies the common belief that compliance can be less than what is possible. The phrase, the ADA sets the floor, not the ceiling, can be explained by the fact that it is a relatively recent piece of civil rights legislation, with its most significant update occurring in 2012. Recent civil rights legislation in the US frequently lacks the teeth of protocol, legal precedent, and enforcement procedures to live up to its promises. The idea of the ADA setting a standard for what is minimally must be done to remain compliant is accurate. However, it would be inaccurate to entirely write off the offices orchestrating the accommodation process as only practicing legal compliance. Many institutions have services and programming that falls outside what the ADA has outlined. GVSU's Student Accessibility Resources, SAR, for example, has a process for students to borrow physical accessibility tools like My Helmet and bone conductors. There are also many support group structures, disability campus community centers, and various pieces of support programming designed to help disabled students. What should be emphasized is the critical lack of transformative, timely, dynamic, person-centered, and adequate accommodations that carry out the active access creation. In the view of critical disability justice advocates, the legal interpretation of the ADA's accommodation system fails to provide the primary service to enable a disabled student's success. In the critical theoretical conception of higher education's problem with creating access, little faith is given to capitalist, colonialist structures of oppression that turn the proverbial dime and suddenly become sufficient support disabled people. More often, radical theories propose a commitment to networks of community aid that are independent of the system. This adds a critical support dimension that addresses individuals' daily needs without relying on traditional systems. One of the communities that live out this disability access empowerment work without centralized direction is queer and trans communities. This is why a lot of CRIP theory is based on queer community practices and theoretical writings. The principles of lived identity inclusion, mutual aid, free education, and intersectionality align well to meet the needs of disabled people. Living a life in the queer disabled community can be rewarding, as it is radically reframes individuals as having inherent value, fosters skepticism towards colonialist system, and advocates for systemic change and encourages involvement in the direct inclusion and empowerment of community members. Most normative conceptions of time, expectation, and requirement are thrown out to create community spaces that respect how people choose to exist. These communities prioritize inclusivity by offering ASL interpretation, various communication modalities, hosting events in sensory-friendly and ADA-compliant venues, providing comprehensive education on drug safety, sexual health, healthy relationships, while ensuring trauma-informed practices that include content warnings, tactfully sharing advice that validates lived experiences. The project solution proposed in this paper is not a call to attempt to recreate the full magic of CRIP queer culture. Instead, it will invite practitioners to unfold how access is not carried out and how to address it, modeling behaviors seen in these radical spaces. Now that the theoretical basis has been established, a concise summary can be made. Disability results from the externalized acts of disablement from inaccessible systems, cultures, spaces, and practices. Higher education is inherently constructed as the antithesis of disability because it acts as a bureaucratic challenge for the most capable, hyper-able students, aiming to eliminate those who not meeting its established standards. The systems created to facilitate support for disabled people purposefully isolate and marginalize the problems, needs, and autonomy to prioritize the continued access of able bodied individuals in all areas of institutional operation. Systemic structures like these create an expected default person from which disabled people are a deviation and thus a problem that must be solved or disposed of entirely. The ugliness of this oppressive structure is covered up by declaring the campus and its academic offerings to be accessible through institution-wide values and the offices which carry out minimal, low-cost, undisruptive compliance with federal legal disability access requirements. The continued inaccessibility and exclusion of disabled people then becomes a routine that cannot be meaningfully addressed or challenged since it is invisible to most practitioners. Objecting to these systemic problems is frequently dismissed as too demanding, needy, or disabled to be respected. The chilling of criticism has led most academic papers on supporting disabled populations being entrenched in existing ways of thought, focusing entirely on students. This project seeks to empower critical community methods, since the dominant methods are too systematically dogmatic to enhance disabled support outside the system effectively. Research and evaluation. Difference between critical disability justice studies and student with disability studies. One of the challenging tasks of orientation that practitioners should undertake before progressing further in the research is differentiating between two seemingly related subjects: critical disability justice studies and the study of disabled student populations, also known as students living with disabilities, SWD. For this paper, we will call it SWD studies. It's a challenging distinction because each field seemingly cites similar theoretical sources, starts with the same phrases, and has similar motivations. The key difference is their separate critical lenses. The articles, books, and chapters in the disability justice field of thought frame a lot more of the deficit and responsibility on the part of the institution and systemic structures that disabled people are forced to exist within. The research study that statistically or qualitatively assess the disabled experience, usually as it relates to a specific key intervention variable like testing time, advising sessions, test scores, etc., are primarily concerned with the student's measured success after the treatment. Studies like these can give us valuable insights and recommendations about increasing support for disabled students within the bounds of existing support structures, usually within the purview of the Disability Office. If this project were to use SWD studies as the primary research basis for the paper, we would be constrained by the limited lens which is locked out of critiquing the systemic structures. Empirical rationality, examining the issues of cause and effect, is not always the best way to address an issue. Inquiring about disabilities requires exploring additional context beyond the obvious. What can we see using the disability justice critical lens? Rather than being constrained to the myopic world of student issues, we can now get a complete picture that includes far more than just students. Most of these higher education studies on disability do not include disabled faculty or staff in the population. We can expand the limited language, like the somewhat stilted SWD, to the more expansive label of disabled people. We now have the option to critique the usually uncritiquable bureaucratic horror that is the ADA accommodation system. Without this piece, it's challenging to justify why practitioners outside the disability office should consider disabilities further than just a referral to that office. We can reap the full benefit of radical cultural ways of knowing and being, the creating collective access CCA model of disabled mutual aid support would be summarily rejected as far outside the legal responsibilities of a practitioner, since it requires caring for the intimate access of a disabled person and playing a critical part in their care. We can examine the parts outside the historically ineffective accommodation system and consider how they can be improved, the crux of this project. An example of how the constrained lens of students with disability studies comes from Pfeiffer's et al.'s paper on disabled STEM students going through the accommodation process. It's a rather detailed look at students' developmental progress as they try to apply their accommodations to their courses. An example on page 13 to 14 describes a situation in which Claudia, a student who received an accommodation for extra testing time, had a conflict with her professor because his pop quizzes did not honor her accommodation. She had debated the issue with her professor, who initially denied her request. When she pressed it, he came up with a solution to give her extra time by picking her test up last. She stated to the researchers that this allotted her 45 additional seconds. This is where the interpretive fissure happens. Researchers wrap up this case by stating, Claudia felt satisfied with the solution, end quote. Page 14. They go on to describe this example as being a successful case of self-advocacy. We should hesitate to accept this conclusion because based on other research about the fatiguing effects of self-advocacy, it is more likely that Claudia gave up pushing the issue further after her professor's persistent rejection and lack of institutional support to make the professor comply. Through a Chomskyan critical lens, we may instead interpret the language the author used as being satisfactory in a technical sense. She did get extra time after she advocated independently. Whether or not that time actually matched what her accommodation letter stated seems to be irrelevant or forgotten. This is the risk of taking students with disability studies on their rational empirical findings. It creates a world where the system as it currently exists seems just logical and self-explanatory. When practitioners encounter this scenario, they should recall how the accommodation system works. The professor has a final say, and they can only be encouraged by the disability office staff to fulfill the students' accommodations. Pfeiffer et al. 2020 may recommend encouraging the student to get back on the horse and try talking to the professor again, thus practicing self-advocacy. Chapter 3 will explore alternative approaches to this scenario, using more support-focused strategies. The overwhelming majority of research is focused on experiences of disabled students rather than faculty, staff, or campus guests. This default orientation limits our view of disability inclusion to mostly students in physical classrooms. To be fair, students make up the majority of the population of an institution, and it's only natural that student affairs would be concerned with practices that enhance the students' success. For this project, disabled people as a label includes disabled faculty, staff, students, and campus visitors. In most critical literature, the dominant label chosen is non-person first language encompassing these populations. The practice of using the label, especially the acronym SWD, could be interpreted as an effort by researchers to distance disabled people from their disabilities. Tucholsky puts it best by stating, the other half of what people first language does is reflect the taken for granted assumption that the disability lacks legitimacy as a way of being human. Page 20, end quote. Not defining disability. Defining disability is necessary for bureaucratic systems to decide what is and is not. The Rehabilitation Act and the ADA were pieces of legislation designed to help specific sections of the population. Identity saliency is how willing someone is to identify with the label of disabled. Stigma, whether anticipated or enacted, associated with the label disabled, prevents many from identifying with it and, by extent, utilizing its associated services. This is what motivated GVSU's Disability Office to change its name from Disability Support Resources to Student Accessibility Resources. Anecdotally, when I asked my disabled peers at GVSU how they felt about the change, they expressed a lot of frustration with the decision because it was an erasure and poorly planned and communicated. Under critical theory, hard applied definitions and labels are inherently exclusionary, since they are often used to deny disabled people their lived experiences and accommodations. Even setting the requirement that people are only considered disabled once a medical professional has diagnosed them is highly questionable for a multitude of reasons related to autonomy, saliency, affordability, and inequity. CAFR has addressed how objecting to the standard is futile because, quote, by presenting these conceptions as apolitical, the Foundation for a Better Life, FBL, renders them natural, accepted, common sense, and therefore beyond the scope of debate or discussion. End quote. Page 86. Pressing the Disability Office staff to defend the commitment to the medical model yields a few arguments that seek to prioritize the opinion of a medical professional over the voice of the disabled person. Practitioners should keep the immutability of medical barriers of using the accommodations process in mind before they refer. Without clear communication about what the process may entail, inquiring about their capacity for process requirements, and acknowledgments of the system's apparent flaws, then people can be chucked into the bureaucratic nightmare with no preparation, as is typical. Disability as a word is associated as an inherently negative and undesirable trait. For example, these common phrases, paraphrased from Tucholsky's 2011, "The referee is blind. You gave only lame excuses. The community was paralyzed. You're driving me insane. These are mad times we're living in." Page 4 through 5. Please do not take away from this that we must simply stop saying these phrases. More must be understood. This association led to disabled people being perceived by default as a problem. This can be seen in the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act definitions, where disability is described as something that limits or is handicapped by their condition. Under the current conception of disability, it's seen as a deviation from the norm, which is to be able-bodied. How our culture views disability as normalcy limits how we can interact with it and usually leads us to devalue it. We view the world as natural, while those who cannot fit are seen as unnatural. This perspective needs to change, as the world we have created is a result of patriarchy, ableism, and colonialism. In summary, why the project will proceed without a definition of disability is because doing so will limit our culture's already limited idea of what is a disabled person. As practitioners go about their day, it is both risky and potentially beneficial to spot and support disabled people as they appear, or not, on our campus. The risk is the assumption that a disabled person must be helped in a certain way. For example, a wheelchair user going up a snowy ramp may not need assistance with the act of getting up the ramp. They may instead need to talk to a staff member about why they just had to cross campus to go to their workplace, which is in another building. However, that information will not be directly evident unless we allow people to feel comfortable disclosing their frustrations with the communicated understanding that we will do more than just refer them to someone else. By refusing a definition of disability, especially in the medical model, we increase the aperture of our critical lens to include ways to help that fall outside traditional means. American Disability Civil Rights History in Higher Education. To understand the American present, we must understand the worldwide past. Since antiquity, infanticide committed by doctors, midwives, and parents was a solution if their baby had undesirable traits. The Enlightenment era was the first time that disabled people as a population were considered to be deserving of help in urban settings. This led to the creation of medical research institutions that tried to cure and contain us. Disabled people in the US have historically been subject to state sanctioned oppression through the use of systems like the slave trade, ugly laws, and sterilization, which removed disabled people from the public view and into homes, sanatoriums, and charitable institutions, prisons, or resident schools. Disabled people are then subject to their caregivers' rule over their lives, and this has led to violence and abuse. Blind, deaf, or dumb schools around North America in the 1800s created specialized education designed around the disability and separated disabled people from the general population. The age of rehabilitation encompasses the civil rights movement and the legislation and court precedents that have created during the second half of the 20th century. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination illegal, provided protections, and added the force of law behind the statutes. However, disabled people were not included in this act. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and its Section 503 did add disabled people to the list of protected groups under the Civil Rights Act. The act created an enforcement system that collected federal money from non-compliant entities. Buildings built before 1977 are not legally required to comply with architectural accessibility features like ramps. Sections 503 outline much of the specific responsibilities of higher education, such as distinguishing colleges from K through 12 systems. By not requiring the university to identify students with disabilities, it became the students' responsibility to make their condition known, seek the assistance of the on-campus disability office, and communicate with their professors. Universities must also inform applicants of what accommodations are available. History of disabled civil rights in the U.S. is some rather unfortunate qualities. Evident by the dates at which these laws were created, the major pieces of legislation were late to the Civil Rights Party. They did not benefit from the intersectional unified context that would have made the law's strength greater than just standing independently. The lawsuits spawned from these protections were often white plaintiffs with single-issue cases, so if there was a victory, the precedents would have little impact on the wide range of disabilities that existed. A significant Supreme Court ruling was Southeastern Community College v. Davis, 1979. It set a legal precedent for what a reasonable accommodation means. Reasonable means it does not place undue financial burden on the institution, fundamentally alter the learning experience, and is not disruptive to regular operations. The student's disability must also not prevent them from filling essential job duties or class duties. In this case, Davis was deaf, and it was determined that a nurse must hear their patients. The ADA and Section 2 codified College v. Davis in legislation and expanded compliance with accessibility laws to almost all private and public entities. This enhanced, detailed historical record of the rehabilitation aligns with how my student affairs classes at GVSU taught them to me. The overall purpose of this narrative is to explain federal requirements for the accommodation of disabled students in higher education. Madhouse and Clunky's 2023 paper titled The Modern History of Disability Services in Higher Education is a comprehensive review of the most recent practice updates since the 2008 update of the ADA and how evolving views of disability have influenced, though not entirely reworked, how disability offices accommodate. Readers may benefit from examining Madhouse and Clunky's 2023 paper, since it has relatively up-to-date information on how court precedents have expanded or contracted the accommodation rights provided by the updated ADA. Giving it a close reading will reveal how intricate these changes are, but ultimately have not led to a meaningful transformation of these systems in any way close to critical disability justice theory. The language used to define how the ADA helps disabled people is that institutions must provide reasonable accommodations to diagnosed disabled students. The problem with this narrative is that it overlooks the current experience of disabled individuals. When the disability office, doctors, colleagues, university staff, course faculty, and various support staff fail to provide an accommodation that meets their needs, arguably, it's more accurate to say that universities must consider providing affordable, undisruptive, and inconsequential accommodations if the student has medical documentation that states they should receive an accommodation from a predetermined list. Whether or not the accommodation was ultimately provided, used, if it meaningfully addressed their needs, is irrelevant to how statutes like the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act are enforced and practiced. Comparing the US and Australian civil rights approaches, the big difference is centralization of administrative funding for support for disabled people. Many disabled Australian civil rights leaders compliment their government for how comprehensively people with disabilities have been integrated into everyday life through substantial funding towards their success. The US system highly depends on local funding sources, medical facilities, and community organizations. This may result from Reagan's attack on federal social support services, leaving the US with a contemporary system that fails to meet even the basic needs of disabled people. Practitioners often do not understand this issue unless they have personally experienced the process or have had an in-depth conversation with a disabled person familiar with it. AHEAD's ADA accommodations process. Under the ADA, legal requirements, the accommodation system was created at individual public and private institutions to ensure compliance. Association on the Higher Education and Disability, AHEAD, is a coalition of experienced professionals in creating accommodations that prioritize the application of reasonable measurement established in Southeastern Community College v. Davis, creating guiding documents that modeled how institutions could create roles, offices, and protocols that would ensure compliance and minimal cost. Using Pfeiffer et al.'s description of the usual accommodation process, this is how it can be mapped. 1. Students submit medical documentation to their disability office. 2. The office approves the documents. 3. Student meets with the disability office staff members to set up initial accommodations. 4. Disability office staff member writes an accommodation letter to the instructor to be delivered by the student. 5. Instructor acknowledges the accommodation letter. 6. Accommodations established for the semester. The process that this list of steps paints is quite neat, but let's employ a critical lens in its analysis by using another research paper as an overlay. Blaisley et al.'s 2022 study tracking 1,980 disabled students as they go through the accommodations process using the Disability Office's internal tracking data as the recording method. This new list inserts various findings from Blaisley et al.'s paper showing where students might fall off during this process. 81% of college students who receive special ed services in high school did not use the Disability Office supports. Blaisley et al. 2022. Students submit medical documentation to the Disability Office. 30% of students get their accommodation request denied. Blaisley et al. Disability Office approves the documents. Students meet with a Disability Office staff member to set up initial accommodations. 71% do not return to the Disability Office to complete the process after their first appointment. Disability Office staff member writes an accommodation letter to the instructor to be delivered by the student. The instructor acknowledges the accommodation letter, the accommodation established for the semester. 25% only use the accommodation for a single semester. The finding of Blaisley et al.'s 2022 study pointed out how important it is for students to be already going through the process during at least the first week of class. The earlier a student begins the process, the more likely they are to continue to use the accommodation and succeed. It is important to point out that this entire process resets at the end of each semester and runs in parallel to the processes for each different classes a student is taking during a semester. Oftentimes, the students are asked to get updated medical documentations to verify they continue to be disabled. The harsh reality of this filtering process can be understood by those who have had the misfortune of actually trying to go through it. Technically, I have gone through the accommodation process 53 times at 2 separate institutions. Having received a bachelor's, associate's, and soon a master's degree, the accommodation process has had a lot of chances to be helpful to me. For my myriad of disability, the accommodations that are provided have been the same boilerplate options over the past 6 years. Even when I push for unique accommodations that address my specific needs, my requests are usually dismissed. In my view, and the views of other academics, these standard options simply create more work than they are usually worth. I could talk endlessly about how awful it feels to go through this process when I am confused, overwhelmed, and in pain. Being told by practitioners that this is the solution that can enable my success places it on a high pedestal. Often users going through this process are in a crisis. It isn't surprising that a new student who is unaware of their disability doesn't begin the accommodation process before the classes start. A typical case is the college freshman who did fine in grade school but now struggles academically. They are referred to the disability office and told they need a diagnosis for their disability if they want accommodations. They set up an appointment with a doctor, get a diagnosis for a learning disability, and return to the disability office to get approved for an accommodation. Now, the student needs the cooperation of their professor in implementing the accommodations. If they aren't implemented, that's on the student. It's easy to see the many places where this system has a potential breakdown. A bad experience with the accommodation system can leave students feeling embittered and less likely to reach out to institutional support if they perceive the disability office as ineffective. Tim Monkern, assistant director of SAR at GVSU, described the accommodation process as a 3-person game of tennis, composed of a student, disability office staff member, and the doctors. After hearing this, I immediately corrected him by saying it was a 4-person game, since the professor was ultimately responsible for carrying out the accommodation. As we have seen with the Claudia example, faculty's accommodation application is a significant barrier. It gets exhausting when professors must be pushed to carry out the accommodation they agreed to do. Faculty report not being knowledgeable, comfortable, or willing to carry out student accommodations. Here is a telling quote from a faculty member in Bosordes et al.'s 2024 study. The student approached me and asked me for help with their, the needs they have. When they come to me, I feel ill-equipped to help them, but I do send them on into the system. Page 172. This is a perfect example of the deflection of responsibility that Careless Care is all about. Another participant in Bosordes et al.'s 2024 study was a dyslexic student who was looking for help accessing a room and assistive technology. I asked the disability services, and she said, go to the student counselors. And the student counselors say, talk to the dean of education. And you have to ask the disability services. End quote. Returning to the early parts of the accommodation process, the medical model is the bedrock of this process since it predicated on the documentation from a medical professional. Ahead says that accommodation offices should at least hear what a student thinks they need. Still, no accommodation should be provided that goes outside the protocol staple accommodation doctor or professors say should be provided. Tucholsky calls this the ethos of mistrust, where the voice and experiences of disabled people within higher education are treated as having inherently less value compared to that of a medical professional. This can stem from the common belief that the accommodations are a way for lazy students to use unfair advantages in their courses. Higher education's preference to largely ignore student desires could be interpreted as an echo of in loco parentis. Pipsna and Smyshrina explains that queer crip communities lack a dehumanizing, bureaucratic process involving brief doctoral consultations. Instead, disabled people are simply believed and honored when they talk about their experiences and needs. During my time working in disabled-centric advocacy, especially in education and medical spaces, we were highly suspicious of the voices of those who were the parental caretakers of their disabled children. Organizations like Autism Speaks were and are considered to be regressive and abusive organizations that center the voices of passionate parents of autistic children who know what's best for their child. In this way, the institution continues to serve the place of the parent by being the only party that can know what's best for the student. We are not suggesting that practitioners should avoid referring to the disability office. Basorti et al. Describes the role of the practitioner as bureaucratic plumbers who get systems unstuck so the existing structures of support can fulfill their original design. Practitioners must be tactful and trauma-informed in broaching what the disability offices have or have not done for them. It's also not recommended for practitioners to pry into the personal medical history of the disabled people they may encounter, even if it's with positive intent. This will be better explored in Chapter 3 when we do a full review of how institutional intelligence, social justice counseling strategies, and CRIP queer community norms can be mixed and leveraged. The Universal Design Solution. Universal design is a set of 7 design principles used to create products and environments that all people use to the greatest extent possible without adaptation or individualized design. According to Cornell et al., the 7 principles are 1. Equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. 2. Flexibility in use. The design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. 3. Simple and intuitive use. The use of design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. 4. Perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. 5. Tolerance for error. The design minimizes hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. 6. Low physical effort. The design can be used efficiently and comfortably and with a minimum of fatigue. 7. Size and space for approach and use. Appropriate size and space is provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and use regardless of user's body size, posture, or mobility. Universal design principles and their accompanying visualization invite viewers to imagine a future where the physical spaces we inhabit allow for the full participation of everyone in the universe through common sense good design. It was developed by Robert Mace, a disabled architect and wheelchair user, who brought his experience of societal material inaccessibility into helping write new accessibility codes in the 1970s. But the bureaucratic process frustrated him enough to create universal design. When the ADA of the 1990s hit, universal design became helpful as a piece of marketing to convince architects and designers of value of accessible design. This shift had consequences when markets detached universal design from the original intention of ensuring disabled people had access and became a method of creating just good design. This shift also changed the terminology to go from capital universal design to lowercase universal design to describe iterations that do not hold themselves to the vision of Mace. It has been assumed that the ADA worked and there was no need to continue to explicitly consider disabled populations when designing. Citing Linton, this erased the line between disabled and non-disabled people and depoliticized through the use of diversity marketing lingo, but omitting the unpleasant disability politics. Universal design in the 2020s has extended to spaces like the promising venture of pedagogy. The educational use case of universal design, known as universal instructional design, is something that my professors in the Master of Education and Higher Education program have expressed great interest in, and it gives me pause to hear them repeat the rhetoric so immediately. Hammerey and Dolmage agree in comprehensively deconstructing universal design promises into well-intentioned but far-reaching, radical, and challenging imperatives that seek to dis-center disabled people in design of public spaces and systems by prioritizing non-disabled people's convenience as normative consumers who will not have obligation to excluded groups. A typical example of the able-bodied benefits of accessibility from universal design is ramps to push carts or automatic door buttons when they are holding something. We should not have to justify accessible design by stating that non-disabled people benefit. Chapter 3 will better address the responsibility of practitioners to prioritize accessible design when creating or managing a space or system. Depending on a practitioner's role, they may or may not encounter these opportunities to prioritize the needs of disabled people in their work. These can be things like designing a scheduling process, planning event schedules, and hosting social events. Each of these examples can be achieved by increasing accessibility as a priority, but learning how takes observation and practice. The practitioner conception of disability support. In one of Tchaikovsky's most interesting critical examinations of how practitioners contextualize disability support, she assesses multiple samples of accommodation process statements found in course syllabi. Students with diverse learning styles and needs are welcome in this course. In particular, if you have a disability or health consideration that may require accommodations, please approach accessibility services. Accommodations include getting a volunteer note taker and writing tests under special conditions. Do not approach your professor or teaching assistant about accommodations. Accessibility Services has necessary expertise and they provide full confidentiality, so your privacy is protected. End quote. Tchaikovsky, 2022, page 112. The second to last sentence is particularly scrutinized, where the professor contradicts the first sentence by stating that students should not discuss accommodations with professors, as that responsibility lies with the disability office. The paradox is how a disabled person can be welcome in a course where they are told not to bring up their accommodations. So many questions are raised about how the professors contextualize their role in enabling access. This example is followed up by a random sampling of more accommodation statements that have similar paradoxical elements. Careless care as a concept can be helpful here to unpack why this repellent statement is attached to a statement of inclusion. In the civil rights section of this paper, we briefly discuss how the narrative from the rehabilitation era in student affairs courses established the expectation that because there are laws stating that accommodations provide equal access has been successfully achieved through the systems established by those laws. The professor in Tchaikovsky's paper seems to have placed all faith in the system to do the work of providing accommodations rather than themselves. It is understandable that this faculty would have come to this conclusion because that is what our industry has continued to peddle in its language. The word accessibility has lost its meaning within higher education. This project will scrape off its veneer so practitioners can find a more applied usage of access. Much attention has been paid to who is allowed into the academy in recent years, and the voices that are not present have been identified. Liberal arts institutions have widely adopted diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility principles, and have begun a long process to promote historically underrepresented ideas. Neoliberal progressive language and buzzwords is what some critical authors like Sins Invalid, Tchaikovsky, and LaJoie point to as holding back our ability to address the deeper systemic issues of disability access in higher education. These buzzwords and their attached rhetoric are usually allowed by dominant players, since they are not used to draw attention to systemic inequity and create pretty sounding world of progressive practices. Tchaikovsky emphasizes that our language around these issues limit our ability to effectively address them, particularly regarding how we understand access, support, and inclusion. The exclusion of disabled people in higher education happens in the mundane, everyday actions of practitioners. Consider for a moment how the accommodation process is structured. The process creates exceptions to the regular state of things. Normal operations of an institution, by default, exclude disabled people, while also stating through its mission statements, core syllabi, and web information about disability that they are included and given access. Tchaikovsky calls this inclusion as an excludable type. Page 11. End quote. The role of disability inclusion is often clearly articulated in institutional public material, yet the responsibility for implementing accessibility measures is confusingly shared among various individuals: doctors, disabled persons, accommodation officers, professors, or space controllers. This situation is referred to as the ambiguous positioning of access. Ambiguity allows anybody within the structure to deflect responsibility for creating access. When we think of how inaccessibility can be seen, we often jump to ramps and automatic doors. What can happen is that we fold these things into natural but masking concepts like family bathroom instead of handicap accessible bathrooms. For example, Braille lettering is commonly used in public spaces to repeat text signage. While well-meaning, this practice is frequently out of touch with those who use Braille or have limited vision. The assumption is that since the minimum compliance standards have been met, we have sufficiently accommodated those it's designed for. We must unmask and recenter these notions. This makes exclusion an invisible thing, and thus hard to conceive of or effectively address. Hyperobjects is a term invented to describe large-scale human issues, like climate change, which cannot be easily conceived because of the inconceivable scale or temporal context. Inaccessibility is a hyperobject, and it usually requires some form of personal experience with access. We must not think of access as a binary. They have it or not. This tricks us into thinking that access is the endpoint, the substance, and the object of concern. Access is more akin to a process. We can stop a repetitive cycle by attending to our perception of disability and the interpretive actions involved in perception itself. Through this process, the end product is an ongoing relationship with concepts that are slowly learned and lived over time. The very language we use to discuss these issues prevents us from meaningfully addressing them. This is a core truth behind Tchaikovsky's work. Critical authors often try to expose these hidden truths to the industry's eyes so we can engage in sustained action to improve access. Breaking the practitioner's conception of what constitutes access is a prerequisite to the application of the new methods of practice proposed by Chapter 3. By increasing the alertness of practitioners, they can begin to find ways to address these issues through change and direct support. Deficit views of disabled people. Viewing disabled students as a problem needing solutions is common under current practice. In the words of Pipsna Samarishna, disabled people requesting help are generally seen as a pain in the ass, page 16, end quote. Employing Chomsky's critical methods, let's look at a block quote from a paper by Hong assessing these challenges disabled students face during college. Quote, "The problem is that students with disabilities often lack the academic, personal, and social skills needed to integrate themselves into higher education. They are less likely to communicate their needs, lack of self-advocacy, less likely to evaluate their own performance, lack of self-regulation, less likely to develop a sense of empowerment, lack of locus of control, and less likely to be aware of their own strengths, interests, and limitations, lack of self-knowledge. This lack of self-determination often results in passive integration into higher education, which leads to social awkwardness, academic challenges, and psychological stress as they struggle their way to assimilate into a new environment." End quote. Hong, 2015, page 210. The framing of disabled students as problems arrives in the second word of the block quote. Lack is said 6 times. The self-identifying pronouns there, themselves, personal, and self are used 10 times. The author uses language like integrate and assimilate throughout. This language indicates an uncritical deficit view where the students do not measure up to normal standards. This view completely blocks out external factors equally responsible for student success. The paper also mentions faculty's negative role in student success, but the paper's framework is called self-determination. Hong summarizes student feelings on how faculty treated them this way. Quote, "They saw their professors as cynical and skeptical adults who did not trust them when they claimed they had a disability and needed academic adjustments." End quote. Page 222. This rhetoric reflects the researcher's general disparagement of the student voice. On page 216, the section titled Fit of Advisors begins with an enlarged and italicized font stating lack of knowledge. One may presume that the advisors, in this context, lacked knowledge, since the paragraph starts with the majority of students in the study stating that their academic advisors were unhelpful and that many students did not seek their assistance. However, the only time the author states who explicitly has a lack of knowledge is when describing the student who chose to do easier courses that were not in their major. The most commonly shared narratives about disability focus on remarkable individuals who have overcome seemingly insurmountable odds to achieve success comparable to or even exceeding that of able-bodied peers. While these stories are genuinely impressive, they create a dangerous expectation that all disabled individuals must achieve the same level of success. Those who do not meet this standard may be unjustly stigmatized as burdensome, wasted, or even seen as fundamentally broken, lazy, unproductive members of society. Another damaging aspect of the narrative surrounding successful disabled individuals is that it reinforces the misconception that they do not need support or assistance. Many disabled people rely on their close family, friends, and complex support networks to fulfill their needs. An uncritical deficit view of disabled people is normalized within higher education, as seen by Hong's ease of critiquing the shortcomings of students. The distinction drawn early in this paper between disability justice studies and studies on students with disabilities is primarily a difference in the deficit view on the critical lens. It's the historically dominant narratives that we see disabled people as the problem that has taken hold in higher education practice, since by its nature it's focused on the empowerment of students academically, athletically, and socially. This project commits to the inversion of narratives to view the shortcomings of our culture and institutions. The disabled student experience. Disabled students are unlikely to succeed in higher education, with 13 to 16% of disabled students graduating high school obtaining a college degree in their life. Disabled students have lower retention rates, take longer to graduate, and have worse grades than non-disabled peers. 81% of disabled people are unemployed. These negative outcomes result from how different K through 12 in higher education are from each other. On top of hundreds of years of capitalistic, ableist systemic oppression, K through 12 in higher education differ greatly in policies for disabled students. K through 12 involves structured accommodations managed by parents and professionals, while higher education places full responsibility on students to secure the necessary support. Unfortunately, information about how the higher education accommodation system works and available accommodations is obfuscated from disabled people, often providing less information and value compared to K through 12 offerings. Without any critical lens, AHELD tells us that this is precisely how it is supposed to work, and practitioners are encouraged only to refer students to the disability office lest they get involved in a process they are not an expert in. However, this is an argumentative way of framing the issue, and works like Abe's et al., Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks, Disability Identities, and Identity Development provide methods of practitioner support. Using any modicum of criticality, it is easy to recognize that over-reliance on the accommodation model is ineffective in promoting the success of disabled students. Requirements pose a significant challenge to disabled people, and higher education is full of non-optional requirements. The materials requirements are entering and using buildings, washrooms, classrooms, and offices. Temporal requirements like getting homework done before due dates and asking for extensions far before the due date. Limited time tests, office hours, building hours, quiet hours, and being on time to class, especially in the first year when universities often drop students who have not attended classes. Requirements to use the essential resources of the bureaucratic institution include filling out forms, reading news, reading, interpreting, and applying policies and following strict reading lists. It also necessitates engagement with professors and events, being cordial and conversational and creating connections that define academic life. Beyond these tangible elements, there are intangible factors, such as what is deemed legitimate participation, the need for a correct sense of meaning, and the need to feel a sense of belonging. For the solution of this project, we must let go of having absolute expectations for disabled people in all of these areas. This requires assessing our deeply held notions about work ethic, the purpose of higher education, and our role as practitioners in the development of students. A person's conception of their disability identity is based on their life experiences, cultural beliefs, and stage of development. Disabled people may not completely understand how their disability impacts them when they get to university. External factors are in constant flux, perpetuating the intangible context of how they navigate their world with their disability. Being disabled in higher education is extremely disorienting. Disabled students are likely living in a new location, away from parents, new doctors, very different academic expectations, a reset on social relationships, and the need to learn a completely different accommodations process. Practitioner or accommodation officer guidance can be invaluable. There are models of disabled student development theory that can help place students on a rough continuum to understand how best to help. A development model proposed by Forbert Pratt and Aragon set stage 1 acceptance phase as being composed of an iteration of identifying the disability, accepting the diagnosis, and the acceptance of a social structure of these facts. Stage 2, relationship phase, is an exploration of the larger meaning of disability through shared experiences with specific people or groups. Stage 3, adoption phase, is when students learn and adapt that community strategy for themselves. Stage 4, giving back to the community phase, involves identifying with and supporting disabled culture. This model of disability identity development is exciting, and I have given disabled student identity development and community formation consideration in my paper, A Reasonable Support Group. However, the solution proposed in this project are not designed entirely around this model, because it is concerned with the development of physically disabled students rather than the whole disabled identity gamut, which is the project's focus. It is also risky to paint this as the path that disabled students should go down, because it requires the engagement of community elements that may not be present or feasible. What is important to take away from this model is the development of a self-perception of disability, which is positive and healthy. After years of being told my disability was an issue, I radically rejected this narrative. I declared my ADHD to be a superpower that empowers me to do things my classmates could not. I took great pride in my disability and allowed me to grow and take advantage of my neurodivergence in my creative, academic, and career pursuits. Suppose practitioners encounter disabled people who have been repeatedly told that their disability is a negative thing. In that case, there may be an opportunity to develop it into a more empowering direction through compliments, affirming of positive self-description, and sharing of disability advocate leader narratives, especially those who share disabilities with the disabled person in question. Chapter 3 will go into more depth on how this empowerment can be manifested. Crip Time. In order to help orient readers who may not be familiar with Crip Time, I will share a story using DSE that will help illustrate the challenges linear time possesses to disabled people. My family noticed how I struggled to understand time as a concept when I was very young. They would tell me that we would leave for a trip in a few hours and I should get my things around. After I felt prepared, I would leave the house and sit in the car, usually hours before we actually left. When they would come out to explain that it would only been a few minutes and it would still be a long time till we left, I would say something to the effect of, well, a few hours is 2 hours, and hours are closer to 30 minutes, and 30 minutes is closer to a couple of minutes, and it's going to take us some time to get there, so we should really get going if we want to be on time. Eventually, my family created a new rule where nobody would tell me when we were leaving until the moment we were leaving. This prevented confusion and frustration for everyone. My elementary school teachers also noticed this problem. They would take me out of class during certain activities to engage in small group lessons with similar students who also struggled with understanding time. We would be given wooden clocks with a crank mechanism to move the hands. Then we would be challenged in various ways to come up with the right time on the clock. I remember the disbelief on my tutor's face as I repeatedly gave him wrong answers with confidence, having absorbed nothing. My professor, Dr. Layla McLeod, can attest to my struggle with understanding time zones when I missed the first class of the school year because my calendar had shifted all my events 2 hours forward. Contrary to conventional assumptions about students' poor time management skills, I am often far too early rather than late. I have come to dub this time anxiety, since I can't exactly trust my perception of time. I presume the need to be early to everything to prevent being late. Tchaikovsky shares a similar example, where her dyslexia made her feel that she was running an hour late the whole day, causing her to abruptly cut a class short an hour early. She then apologized to the class because her dyslexia had mixed up.
By doing so, she helped her class make sense of the mix-up within the context of how they perceive time. All these examples can be explained with the concept of crip time. Crip time originates from the critical crip theories and explores how time as a temporal experience for disabled people is often out of sync with normative conception of time. For disabled people, keeping track of time is not as simple as getting a watch, keeping a calendar, and estimating how much time all the tasks in the day take. Tasks often take much longer than typical, and attention can be stretched thin, causing us to lose track of it. Practitioners must understand this reality and balance their normative expectations with cultural understanding. If practitioners carry a deficit view of the disabled perception of time as being unprofessional and disorganized, they may perpetuate messages the person would have heard before. Advice like getting a wristwatch, keeping a planner, setting a reminder are things they have likely heard before, and repeating them may bring up previous guilt over not being able to engage with tools so useful to the non-disabled. Instead of jumping right to providing advice, more could be discovered by inquiring into the steps taken before arriving at class. This discovery process could yield insights about the other students' challenges that would not have been immediately obvious. Chapter 3 spells out many clear examples of how to apply support solution-based thinking, and will hopefully develop a more intrinsic understanding of disabled challenges. Disabled community. It was clear I was a little different from other kids my age. Some might say a little queer. My parents constantly threatened me to do better in class, or else I would be put with the special ed kids. Students in the special education classes in my school were physically abused regularly by staff. I already had enough physical abuse at home, so I would usually rally to stay out of the horrors in that space. I volunteered for a program where I was paired with a special needs student to play with during recess. A few girls in my class also volunteered, but they quickly became uncomfortable with spending time with someone whom none of their friends wanted to be anywhere close to. Each day, they asked me to pick up their shift, and each day I agreed and played with another student. From a young age, people who were different, misfits, and outcasts would orbit around me. This led me eventually creating queer communities in my hometown, and eventually onto local, state, and national advocacy work in my intersectional initiatives like My Access. Through My Access, I learned to verbalize much of the critical disability rhetoric I had been developing through my life. Finding disabled community enabled me to fully understand how I navigate through the world and take action in my own life to improve my level of access. Ultimately, this is what most informed this project, a radical desire to see disabled people empowered through degree acquisition and, by extension, survival. The model of disability identity development illustrates that stages that help us advance are in those which we receive affirmation from our families, friends, and community, as well as from peers who share our disability. Ultimately, a community focused on disability justice fosters progress in its surroundings and works to empower its members. North American disability civil rights history has a beautiful and powerful culture of grassroots networks of community support. Marsha P. Johnson's legendary Star House in the early 1970s is a shining example of radical queer intersectional support by providing housing, food, and protection from police brutality. These care webs, as Pipsa Shamirishna names them, are collective access initiatives where disabled and able-bodied people pool time, resources, and expertise to make up for the lack of state care workers. These tight 15 to 3-person groups were built on the practices of mutual aid, the voluntary reciprocal exchange of resources and services for mutual benefit. And CRIP made access solutions made by and for disabled people only. These independent care collectives had their start in the 2010 Allied Media Conference and U.S. Social Forum, which would bring thousands to meet in Detroit to imagine a revolutionary social justice future. 13 queer, trans, disabled people of color scrammed into a car that was only supposed to fit 4 and worked to make sure everyone had their access needs met through the week's conference. Creating collective access CAA spawned the CCA model of Crip care collectives, and many more would pop up all over North America. Pipsna Samarishna book Care Work Dreaming of Disability Justice, she explores the CCA model's origin and long-reaching impacts while distilling her best recommendations for the model's continued use. The dynamic, Crip-centric methods outlined in the CCA model can effectively be applied to higher education practices by practitioners who are genuinely committed to supporting disabled populations within their institutions. Whatever is created from CCA cannot be a direct translation, since the amount of time and intimacy this model fully necessitates would not be realistic within the limited interprofessional relationships that practitioners will have with students, staff, faculty, and campus visitors. Most likely, the solution will seek to integrate disabled student development models with critical Crip queer models and CCA learnings. This would enable practitioners to keep vigilant for common pitfalls in higher education accommodation system and supplement some administrative support for the student by providing grounded, motivating advice that makes the disabled people at the institution feel they have a person they can come to discuss these challenges with and brainstorm solutions if they would like. This begins the change-making process as the practitioner and the disabled people grow in mutual understanding of shared values of radical access. Summary. To address historic problems with the HEDS accommodation model, practitioners will learn new methods of practice based on queer Crip critical theory and cultural practices where everyone in the community is responsible for creating access for disabled people. Using Tchaikovsky's critical authorship and critical feminist Crip and queer theories, we chiseled away contemporary North American models of disability support that are popularly used or discussed in higher education. In clear terms, the way we as practitioners conceive of disability is systematically opposed to adequate disability support because it prioritizes the separation of disabled people into bureaucratic processes that are ineffective in providing transformative accommodations. Careless care, as Tchaikovsky describes, uses illusory progressive language to mask the unpleasant realities of how inaccessible and hostile colleges are structured against disabled people. Practitioners assume the ADA has sufficiently provided for the access needs of disabled people, and that little to no additional effort is worth discussing. This results in abysmally poor outcomes for disabled individuals, such as that only 13% of disabled people earn a degree in their lifetime, and 81% of disabled people are unemployed. By the end of the paper, our proverbial sculpting studio had the crumbled remains of students with disability studies, single-issue disability civil rights, institutionalized accommodations, universal design, deficit-based thinking of disabled people, and the conception of normative time lying discarded for the purposes of this project. Each of these concepts must be addressed as ultimately not useful in our goal to create an active, caring generation of practitioners who will work each day to increase the accessibility of the spaces they impact for the benefit of disabled people. Instead of throwing away all current solutions, Accessibility Care Beyond the University Disability Office new methods of practice for disability inclusion promise to work into existing systems throughout the everyday actions of practitioners. This process starts with addressing the basic conceptions, assumptions, and notions commonly held by higher education practitioners. By identifying the risk of these uncritical ideas and providing new ways of thinking, practitioners can begin an internal developmental process that buds through counter-conversation of greater inclusion and alternatives to bureaucratic processes, and ultimately blossom into networks of professional staff outside the disability office who work toward a non-centralized goal of transformative access for all disabled people. Chapter 3. Project Description. Introduction. The support provided by the ADA to disabled people in higher education has significant gaps that practitioners must help fill throughout their daily work. This project offers new methods of practice synthesized from various sources critical of current practice. AMBI solutions are dual products that provide separate approaches to addressing a given scenario, but are not mutually exclusive in their implementation. They can both be utilized simultaneously without disruption to existing systems. A goal is that through the application of AMBI solutions, practitioners will become more comfortable making support contributions with and for disabled people. Through dialogue and collaboration, practitioners and disabled people can help each other find effective solutions. This creates an active and supportive network of practitioners dedicated to enhancing the accessibility of spaces. The AMBI solution exercise objectives are first to address practitioners' current notions of the value of higher education accessibility practices. Second, to provide a developmental path towards increased recognition of ableism and inaccessibility, and third, to demonstrate how practitioners can insert themselves into the work of disabled support. Returning to an earlier analogy, the block of marble has been refined into a form that is satisfactory for our next step of the project. In Chapter 1, we selected the disability support block of marble from the student affairs quarry that required work. Chapter 2 was primarily dedicated to explaining why mainstream practices is not for practitioners beyond the disability office. As the previous chapter progressed, we identified more specific area of operation within the daily practice of practitioners. The imperfections and unrelated chunks were removed with the hammer and chisel of critique. Chapter 3 has been reserved for the employing of creative techniques to develop methods of daily practice. The finer tools will carve out the details of our sculpture and allow for a more complete interpretation of the ideas presented in this project. After this introduction, there are the project components divided into 3 sections that address the primary sequential project objectives designed to integrate information from the previous chapters into a curricular plan of developmental learning. Project components includes the fruit of Chapter 3, AMBI solutions. Then an evaluation section will be provided outlining how the exercise's outcomes can be measured. The conclusion summarizes how accessibility care beyond the University Disability Office has completed its objectives through its research. Finally, the implementation describes where AMBI solutions can fit into higher education ecosystem through the publication, presentation, and future iterations that will be shared with fellow practitioners who want to do more to support disabled students. It is important to note the risks of over-application. The ideas suggested in this solution may push the boundaries of what a practitioner should be reasonably capable or comfortable with. It is easy to pick one line of thinking and run it to worrisome extremes. The intended message of this document is generally applicable strategies that should be applied wisely. The primary products readers should take away is the commitment to recognizing how bureaucratic systems fail disabled people around us. Through that recognition, actions can be taken to remedy the situation through collaborative input with relevant persons. We are not suggesting that practitioners somehow take over the management of someone's accommodation case or inquire about a student's intimate medical history. Project components. See Appendix B for training materials. The objectives of practitioner development are in sequential order and inform the project's design. The strategies employed in creating new methods of practice are a synthesis of various perspectives, including higher education, social justice advising, and counseling models. Critical reinterpretations of university practices through a radical disability lens. The CRIP queer theory of community and identity autonomy, different practice models for disability justice, and historical norms and practices of mutual aid networks, and personal professional experiences in facilitating access within educational institutions, medical spaces, and community settings. This development process transforms practitioners from passive observers into change makers. The responsibility of this project is to guide practitioners through a journey of recognition, open observation and dialogue, empathy, exploration of current outcomes, considerations of alternatives, interventions, proposals of solutions, and advancement of positive causes. First stage, re-encountering. The first objective is to dismantle dominant notions of how higher education conceptualizes and implements access by critiquing the current, often minimal and legalistic accommodation process, while recentering disabled people's lived experience to expose addressed root barriers. A significant shift in perspective is necessary, which means that actual modification to workplace practice should be delayed until previous misconceptions are largely discarded. Failing to take this step can lead to well-intentioned but misguided attempts to accommodate the needs of disabled people, potentially overlooking their desires, autonomy, and privacy. When outsiders interpret the lives of disabled individuals, there are often invisible dynamics at play that can affect the effectiveness of support efforts. It is second nature to defer a disabled person to the disability office, even if they cannot meaningfully address their needs. When confronted with meeting the needs of a disabled person, we may feel unqualified and refer to someone or something we view as better suited to serve them. This reflex to refer out causes us to miss opportunities to be supportive in those moments of need. When faculty members are faced with implementing accommodations, confusion, discomfort, and conflicting priorities often arise, impacting how these accommodations are executed. Practitioners often overlook that there are more than just disabled students at their institution. Disabled faculty, staff, and campus visitors can also be supported through this work expansion. North American higher education is, by default, inaccessible to disabled people. An accommodation from the Disability Office is an exception the government requires under the threat of civil rights violations. The accommodations are most often minimally compliant when used, but the majority of disabled people and students do not end up utilizing these resources because of the myriad barriers to obtaining, implementing, and sustaining them. Yet, we call our universities inclusive of disabled people. Just because we call something accessible does not make it accessible. We should not settle for minimally compliant systems. Second stage, recognition. The second objective aims to provide a developmental framework for practitioners to identify gaps in support and pinpoint the systemic, programmatic, environmental factors in higher education perpetuating inaccessibility for disabled students. Recognizing the impacts of ableist systems involves understanding how they manifest. Access is guaranteed at no point in the accommodation process. Even when medical documentation and letters have been approved and a conversation is had with the faculty or professional staff agreeing on how the accommodations work, there is no assurance that these accommodations will be implemented as agreed upon or at all. The failure to carry out accommodations is an anticipated outcome to the extent that we emphasize the importance of independent self-advocacy skills, rather than focusing on responsibilities of those responsible for implementing the accommodations. The institution is not responsible for identifying disabled people or confirming the accommodations are carried out. All responsibility and consequence is on the disabled person to ensure their accommodations is implemented. Access is not a binary, yes or no. It's a process that continually shifts as variables change. Being cognizant of this means actively monitoring and supporting in dynamic ways. This requires communication with disabled people about their needs. A strong method of facilitating a relationship built on support, information exchange, and mutual growth is the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies, MSJCC. MSJCC was created to address the root issues faced by marginalized students within historically oppressive systems. This critical model encourages professionals in higher education to recontextualize dominant colonial frameworks. The most effective intervention strategy for our purpose is a commitment to collaborative change between the advisor and the student. Dialogue, where the practitioner discovers the root cause of challenges the student faces, fits really well in better identifying issues of inaccessibility in the university. Because of identity saliency, many do not acknowledge their disabilities until some event, diagnosis, conversation, or thought process occurs that brings them to some awareness, acknowledgement, or acceptance stage of their identity development. Heightened awareness of these issues is often most effectively achieved through personal experience. When faced with inaccessibility, individuals find themselves in direct conflict with the external world, both physically and mentally. The strong emotions resulting from such an experience create lasting memories of discomfort that resurface in similar situations. Developing empathy and understanding becomes essential for those who have not directly encountered systemic ableism or inaccessibility. By leaning on the perspectives of the disabled person needing support, we can better focus on what needs to be addressed. Without this perspective, we may jump to provide solutions or point to causes that are ultimately not impactful. We invite increased dialogue through affirmation of the challenges they experience, letting them know we care and we are here to support them. The value this forms of empowerment brings is best explained in Feminist Queer Crip by Kaffer 2014. Communal solidarity makes people feel a sense of belonging, safety, and confidence. With this motivation, the disabled person can feel bolstered in addressing the challenges they face, especially when they know they have someone in their corner. Participating in the AMBI Solutions exercise will be important for beginning this practitioner development process. However, what will likely be just as useful is engaging in sincere inquiries about the experiences faced by disabled individuals and committing to address these challenges in our daily work. This means consuming works created by disabled people, attending conference presentation, workshops, or training on disability inclusion in higher education practice areas, and getting to know the staff who work in the various support offices on campus, especially the disability office. Third stage, action. The third objective is to offer flexible practice methods through examples, scenarios, and guides that empower practitioners to address the accessibility challenges identified in the second objective. Practitioners have a responsibility to support disabled individuals beyond simple referrals. In Abe's et al. Chapter on disability, they described a practitioner who is attentive, communicative, and dedicated to the developmental and success of disabled students. The standards established by higher education institutions for supporting disabled individuals are marked by low administrative oversight and high bureaucratic complexity. Practitioners can help a disabled person through bureaucratic challenges in both the academic and personal spheres. But how are decisions on what to do made? For a method of inquiry and for examples of what would be appropriate, we rely on queer crip culture through the lens of institutional intelligence. Institutional intelligence is asking ourselves and those we work with questions to develop informed decisions. These questions keep students personally and the institution safe and more supportive. Institutional intelligence questions are all in service of the actions taken, given the question's reflections. It's trying to answer the questions, what do I do, and what that it is. A goal of institutional intelligence is to identify how laws, ethics, and institutional characteristics affect our decisions. Using institutional intelligence is not the path to being a perfect worker. Problematic decisions are still possible, even if all the questions were asked. Another important point to address is trying to help is best described by Boettcher and Salinas. Quote, there are internal and external stakeholders with different priorities and expectations. Making as informed a decision as possible will often leave some people or teams unhappy. Your decisions may not stand. Others may question your action you took. That is the reality of doing difficult work in challenging circumstances as part of a complex organization. Page 104. End quote. There is one small thing to address. Institutional intelligence as a term is ableist language because intelligence carries contextual weight on how we perceive practitioners and students' disabilities. Comments like, they could have used a little more institutional intelligence, are problematic microaggressions because they place intelligence with a ranked hierarchy of poor and good. What we label as bad intelligence often carries ableist, sexist, and racial connotations. However, with respect to Boettcher and Salinas, this paper will continue to use the term. Institutional intelligence will serve as a unified binding method to link methods of inquiry to disparate theoretical systems. What makes it useful for this role is to general higher education institutional nature underpinned by legal and ethical considerations that help prevent liability and harm. What this means in practice is that we can just ask a lot of questions, and via asking, we arrive at balanced conclusions based on the situation we are faced with. Here are some questions to ask using this model. What do I do? Would you like some help? Is this level of light, temperature, noise okay? What can we do to make a positive change in this moment or in the future? When will we know if we have succeeded or resolved the situation? How can we create positive change based on this situation and what we learned? Who can help? What does my office do? What are my responsibilities? Is this too much work to put on this person? Incorporating queer crypt culture into practice may seem daunting for practitioners. However, insights from the cultural practices of CCA can help identify support that disabled people need and how to offer it in a way that is informed by their experiences. CCA establishes a communication spaces, such as social media groups or group calls, to identify who needs support, what type of care is required, for which disabilities, and during what specific times of the day. Built on the principles of mutual aid networks, the group collaboratively determines who has the capacity, transportation, food, skills, relevant strengths, experience, and availability to meet the identified needs. These structures are impressively fast and resourceful when adapting, empowering disabled individuals to expand their collective capabilities. Many communities that engage in these practices often pool resources collectively because they have been denied state disability status, which allows them to have part-time caregivers. The tenets of CCA help maintain a balance of contributions and capacities within the group, allowing them to remain unconscious of sociocultural power dynamics and foster a more sustainable community that provides critical assistance to keep individuals alive. Here is a paraphrased list of tenets from Care Work. Communicate using simple, non-academic words and avoid assuming sounding smart is the best approach. Use text when possible. Don't make assumptions. Always ask if you can touch someone, what they call their body or condition, if they want suggestions, if they just want someone to listen. Each disabled person is an expert in their own body and mind. Understanding that disabled individuals often have full-time job managing their disabilities and navigating the medical system. Adjust your expectations regarding work, energy, and life. Recognize that state accommodation reviews can be intimidating. Food stamps can be stressful, and missing a specialist appointment is not an option. Going to a doctor is not necessarily the first response, and a lot of money goes towards medications. Negotiating pain in work is a constant challenge. There is a spoken or unspoken understanding that both parties will contribute what they can and stop if necessary, accepting a no without taking it personally. Pay attention to someone's facial expressions, body language, and energy to gauge if they are in pain or struggling. Notice signs of pain, fatigue, overwhelm, and triggers. Simple phrases like, "hope you feel better," or "that sucks," are not appropriate responses when a disabled person describes their situation to an able-bodied person. Do not shame people for being in bed. The current societal concept of health can be harmful. Beds, cars, and houses are important and valid spaces. When someone says, "I feel like shit," or "I'm feeling sick," respond with, "I'm sorry. What feels possible today?" Instead of saying, "Stay home, don't do it, let me do it for you." Things will break. Paratransit will be delayed, and everything will take longer. These delays are a result of a world that doesn't adequately value or invest in access. Offer help, but if it's declined, don't hesitate to offer again. Disabled individuals are often conditioned to deny assistance. Be ready to offer to help with tasks like laundry more than once, knowing it may take time for them to accept your offer. Only offer what you can genuinely provide. Always ask before offering help, and clearly communicate when you are unable to assist. Actions done loudly are not passive-aggressive. We may have been taught to perceive them that way. Offering cures is not appropriate. People do not need to be fixed to be valued. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Saying, "do self-care," is not helpful. Never assume anything. CRIP emotional intelligence involves not taking it personally when a disabled person is rude to you for a moment, understanding the impacts of isolation, not taking it personally when someone cancels plans. Continue to invite them to activities and make sure to remember them. I can personally attest to how common these habits are practiced in BIPOC queer CRIP spaces. I can also attest to how rarely these are followed in any other space, including the disability office, medical facilities, or professional health conferences dedicated to disability. When I was recovering from a concussion in 2022, it was hard for me to do a lot of basic life tasks. My POTS had also resurfaced and would bring my mind and body to a restrained, tired state. Without the support of a close friend, I would have had a much harder time recovering. With many of the disabled people in my life, I formed a strong bond with those who cared for me, and those I cared for. The first time I hung out with this friend was when I drove them to the emergency room. The queer CRIP relationships I have had fundamentally influenced why I can write this project. The deep feelings of injustice that spark up when blatant ableist structures cause irreparable damage to our lives are fuel for my motivation. I have always felt that higher education desperately needs more development towards the support of disabled people. Having a project to express this sorely underpowered voice is liberating. I want to distill some of the cultural habits that have allowed me and many other disabled folk to continue to live and exist within our institutions. Disability culture is a bold reclamation of autonomy from systemic administrative neglect. This autonomy is held in balanced communion with multiple networks of support that contribute to a mutual aid socialized economy. The voluntary extension of personal and often intimate support is how communities have been supported each other since time immemorial. Participation in the economy of aid is how resources such as energy, time, effort, medicine, money, housing, communication, and mobility are distributed. Held in a non-centralized collective, the capacity to help must be pulled for interpersonal support as needs arise.
Mutual aid is rooted in a socialistic framework of communal support, where favors, resources, or assistance are freely given without a prescribed expectation of repayment, though reciprocity is regularly practiced. Within disability culture, primarily, it is understood that and accepted that contributions to these networks may vary widely, and equal reciprocity is neither required nor expected. Living in this culture can feel like a deep love, as a close friend provides attention, care, and love without any overwhelming power dynamic or a debt dynamic that restricts who, how, or why can be. AMBI solutions. See Appendix A for a complete list of the AMBI solutions. AMBI solutions are a set of examples that compare current methods and alternative methods of support relevant to the care of disabled people. The Latin word ambi means both, or on both sides. It appears in words like ambidextrous, which means being able to use both hands skillfully, and ambiguous, which refers to having more than one meaning. These examples have been intentionally chosen because they effectively reflect the project's themes. Ambidextrous relates to the ability to use both hands with skill and flexibility. Earlier in this project, we discussed the ambiguous positioning of who provides access within bureaucratic institutional settings. In this context, both means that it is the responsibility of both systems and staff to provide accommodations, just as it is the responsibility of the disabled person to actualize these accommodations to make them truly useful. In the case of AMBI solutions, the term signifies the use of both current industry practices and new alternative approaches. The fact is that a heads accommodation system is here to stay. Our responsibility as practitioners is to encourage disabled individuals to navigate the often daunting bureaucracy to reach the other side and reap the benefits. When accommodations are implemented early and utilized consistently throughout an educational career, they have effectively improved academic outcomes. Additionally, the other side of the solution offers an alternative approach to the same issue. This approach divides the care process into different branches, addressing the concerns of often overlooked accommodation processes or the programming of disability offices. A helpful image is a Venn diagram representing various institutions' roles in supporting disabled individuals, as illustrated in Figure 2. The figure is titled Venn diagram of responsibility. It's made out of 3 circles, all intersecting with a triangle formation in the center, with the title AMBI Solutions being in between the yellow circle of Disability Office Advisors' professional responsibilities, higher education practitioners' professional responsibilities, and intimate support persons' contributions to care. Inside of all of that is AMBI Solutions. By identifying what is realistically possible within a practitioner's role, we can establish appropriate boundaries. Exceeding these limits can lead to unintentional harm caused by well-meaning interventions, such as violating privacy rights, blurring professional boundaries, taking on responsibilities better suited for other professionals, and potentially doing more harm than good. The goal is that as practitioners become more comfortable in their roles, they can take on greater input to help guide individuals with disabilities towards effective solutions. This requires an understanding of what is feasible within the existing system and open communication with people with disabilities. As practitioners develop these skills, they will better understand the issues and envision new ways to address the original challenges. AMBI solutions are designed to be flexible in their applications. Over-application or poorly planned decisions are potential outcomes if practitioners are not balanced in their interpretation and uses of AMBI solutions. Institutional intelligence highly encourage exploration of different relevant perspectives of disabled people, practitioners, researchers, and campus support partners and supervisors. Attending seminars related to disability, reading some of the primary reference material, or just existing in disability-centric communities can greatly support increased active attention and solution crafting. Appendix A, AMBI Solutions. Disclosure of access challenge, invite more dialogue. When confronted with a disclosure of disability-related challenges, practitioners automatically connect the services of the Disability Office as being a potential solution for those problems. After a referral is given, it's common to move on the other matters, since the Disability Office would be better equipped to help in those matters. There is potential for learning more, a more complete orientation to accommodation process, networking with the existing disabled community, and ongoing support connections. Stigma, real or anticipated. Processing impacts. Disclosing a disability can often be met with changes in behavior that implicitly reflect their feelings about that disability. An autistic person can be easily dismissed as too incapable of understanding something. If self-disclosure and self-advocacy are not well prepared, then it's easy to encounter obstacles that challenge any further attempts. Through proper discussion, disabled individuals can feel more confident in how effectively deliver their message and manage the perception of their disability. Overloaded by life, assist processing to encourage rest. Disabled people can get extremely flustered by the obstacles thrown in their way. They may feel lazy and have little hope. It's important to balance these feelings by providing space to listen, promoting processing strategies, engaging with the support system, and ensuring rest is prioritized. Not feeling alone is the most considerable help through this. Help them pace to be realistic for their capacity. Accommodation ineffective. Find temporary solutions. People can be devilishly creative when faced with obstacles. Just because an accommodation is missing doesn't mean we need to invent an entire other accommodation. What can be found in the interim can be a compromise, workaround, or circumvent the original issues that may or may not be solved by the system. Limited modality, use transitional aids. Carrying around a big bag of tricks that helps for specific situations to be deployed when the situation comes up can be a massive comfort. Developing these tools takes trial and experimentation. The goal is to try to find what can work better at the moment and inform future items or choices around these tools. Disconnect between support systems. Inquire best communicative approaches. Addressing the root cause of miscommunication can go a long way in preventing future incidences. This conversation would be friendly and form a basis of curiosity about why systems are structured in this way. Understanding your role can help you figure out how you would like to be supportive by being more informed. Late. Practicing CRIP time. Many scoff at the concept of CRIP time because they view a critical perspective on fundamental dimensions of physics as being literally unrealistic for practice. CRIP time's target is oppressive uses of time to separate others as being less valuable compared to those with a better conception of time. The label is unprofessional and is thrown onto any slip in adherence to schedule. As practitioners, it is largely our duty to prepare students for a wide range of professional fields. Part of this responsibility is attending to the development of a strong Western work ethic in skills like time management. If we want to create spaces and systems where disabled people can thrive, then we should work to reduce the influence of linear time on our perception of people. Viewing people who are chronically tardy as unorganized, unproductive, and unprofessional allows for the dominant ableist narrative to control perceptions of people who are trying their best. What did your doctor say? What do you think? The medical model states that only those educated in medical science can interpret the bodies of disabled people to determine their needs. The accommodation process is reliant on the ritual mistrust of disabled people. This can feel dehumanizing since agency is ignored. Buffering this dehumanizing effect is an integral part of being supportive through the accommodation process. This can be done through confirmation that the system does not prioritize the needs of disabled people as disabled people state them. However, this does not mean that the disabled voice is irrelevant. Disabled people should know that their perspective can yield positive results. Inadequate basic skills. Shame is not necessary. Failing to do any of these skills risks not looking competent, but competence is not hinged on being able. What can be perceived as failing or areas needing growth does not need to be met with a negative response. Stamping down stigmatizing reactions is an important step toward normalizing a culture outside of historic ableism. Travel required, travel not an issue. Traveling any distance can be a challenge if the conditions and context do not allow for easy movement. Motivation to undergo a stirring, sweaty, and costly trip can be especially hard to muster. The socioeconomic dimensions of travel paint travel as a significant barrier to many. Creating programs that offer multiple modalities or are located in convenient locations for the community can help remove many potential barriers for everyone from the outset. Helping brainstorm real challenges to transportation can be helpful if you know how others have solved this or have a strong solutions yourself. Project conclusions. We must find new ways to tackle access issues without waiting for the system to improve. Recognizing these problems and seeking solutions is essential. The ADA falls short when providing adequate university accommodations and supports to disabled people. A shiny facade of accessibility slogans often hides the underlying neglect that bureaucratic systems tend to create, which is built around a legal precedent focused on minimizing potential costs. Practitioners outside of the Disability Office can significantly address these issues through direct contributions to increasing accessibility. The future we envision transcends the relationship between disabled people and the Disability Office. Instead, it embraces a more holistic method of communal support. By elevating disability culture and integrating it into daily practices, we can achieve a more equitable distribution of responsibilities across the whole campus to enhance accessibility. Through this collaborative effort, we as practitioners can begin to transform higher education's culture to meet the needs of all disabled people.